If you've read the title to this video, then you've probably already started to type out your comment about how I'm dumb or have terrible taste, etc. But if you've seen my Ratchet & Clank video before, then you should probably know what to expect out of this one. And funnily enough, my history with Devil May Cry and Ratchet & Clank are actually both quite similar. Both of which being games that my brother owned when I was a kid and he would let me play when he wasn't using the PS2. Ratchet obviously appealed to me because I was a kid, but DMC targeted a very specific part of my brain that developed from being exposed to Shadow the Hedgehog at the vulnerable age of 4. Though, frankly, while I enjoyed these games, I did suck at them as a kid, because of course I did. So, until my late teen years where I picked up the HD collection, my experience with the series was pretty limited save for a few core memories of various cutscenes and bosses, along with wandering aimlessly around hallways as I never really paid attention to the puzzle elements. Luckily, by then, I was able to not only complete the games, but actually appreciate character action for what it was, a type of hack and slash that prioritized player expression through the game's combat, where each and every move can be stringed together like words in a sentence, opposed to other action games which only really gave you canned, pre-made phrases to fight with. And Devil May Cry 1 is what started it all. Probably. It was the harbinger of a new style of action combat, putting many of Capcom's gameplay philosophies of the time at the forefront of its design. However, being the first of something new within art also means that over time, you're more than likely going to become the least refined of that thing as successes come and go, building upon what you created. Devil May Cry and character action as a whole have evolved far past where it all began, to the point where this original game could arguably be called archaic in comparison. One could say that these days the first Devil May Cry game is beginning to show its age, be it via graphics, voice acting, story, or even gameplay. They may even say that this game has aged like milk. I, however, believe that while this may be true depending on how you look at things, these rough edges are actually a good thing. Because it's only by leaving milk out that you're able to make fancy gourmet cheese. Something that's not necessarily to everyone's taste, but really appeals to the ones it does. And so in this video, I want to go over everything there is to talk about in DMC1 and really analyze what makes it so uniquely special compared to more contemporary examples within the subgenre, and how a lot of what could be considered faults or blemishes by today's standards are actually secretly part of the game's key strengths that allow it to remain one of my favourites even when standing side by side with its much more refined younger siblings. And I also just really want an excuse to talk about DMC1 because I think the game's really cool and probably the most overlooked. Now, Devil May Cry's aesthetic, tone, and appeal is very easy to see just by looking at it. It's a fast-paced game where you run around and hit things with a big sword. It's as good as a concept as any, really. But to set up the scene properly, you play as Dante, the half-human son of the legendary Dark Knight Sparda, a demon who one day woke up to justice and turned against his brethren to protect the human world which he had now fallen in love with. The game begins with Dante lounging around his office, the titular Devil May Cry, which he uses as a home and base for his demon-slaying business. He may ultimately be a good guy, but as external media within the franchise unfortunately shows, being a hero doesn't exactly pay the bills, nor does it pay for your tabs at the local diner and pizza parlor. After a few short lines expertly establishing Dante's character and Devil May Care personality, we're suddenly treated to a literal white woman jump scare as this mysterious stranger appears to remind us that The Matrix was only released 2 years prior. Through a bit of tense banter and a slight scuffle, we discover that this femme fatale's name is Trish, and she's come here to tip Dante off to the resurrection and return of the Demon King Mundus. Which is something that Dante would probably be very interested in, since the guy is not only a threat to just about everyone, but also the very same demon who was responsible for the deaths of both Dante's mother and his brother Virgil. What's particularly interesting as an early narrative hook is that the former is the splitting image of Trish herself. Or rather, as identical as you can get comparing a early PS2 model to a drawn piece of 2D art. Now, DMC1, like many Capcom games at the time, is a little notorious for its impeccable voice acting.
Ah! No, this isn't happening! There's no reason for me to go on. What? What am I fighting for?
And we'll get there, don't you worry. But honestly, this opening scene is done really well. It provides us with the building blocks for this setting's world, it sets up the core plot and end goal, and establishes our protagonist whilst also creating an air of mystery around our supporting character. All while having a short and sweet action scene to really excite the player, and it does all of this in under 4 minutes. The voice acting in this scene isn't even bad here, it's nothing special per se, but it's perfectly adequate. If you're only familiar with the newer games, it may seem a little bit odd to you that Dante is a little bit cooler-headed and calm compared to the wacky woohoo pizza man that he usually is depicted as these days, but thanks to years of retconning and headcanons, this is easily explainable with a few grains of salt. That basically boils down to bro's going through a lot right now, he's got to fight his own demons. Now, the thing about the Devil May Cry game's stories is that they are chuny as fuck. They're very over the top, they're very edgy, and they're very campy. And because of that, they can often get poo-pooed aside as something that has no real substance to it, like an Evanescence album. After all, the gameplay is the main draw. It's not a case of style over substance, it's that the style is the substance. Hell, I myself can be guilty of dismissing it at times, and I love the series. And at risk of sounding like I'm 14 and this is deep, I do think, much like Shadow the Hedgehog, if you approach DMC with a certain level of sincerity and meet the game on its own terms, there's plenty of stuff that's worth talking about. One weak link in the chain that I do want to talk about in particular, however, is Trish, because honestly, she's been done kinda dirty for the whole franchise. But we'll get to that when we get to that. For now, let's talk about the gameplay for a bit. As many of you probably know these days, Devil May Cry was originally supposed to be a new game in the Resident Evil series, a prototype to Resident Evil 4, but ultimately became too action-focused and different that the devs realised what it was becoming no longer resembled the series and decided to pivot it into becoming its own original IP. Also, Final Fantasy VI was called Final Fantasy III when it originally released in America, and Super Mario Bros. 2 is just a reskinned version of a game called Doki Doki Panic. We all know this, and yet I have to include it for the one person who doesn't, just so they can be on the same page for later points. There is part of DMC1's origins that are less talked about, however, and that is its influence from another game that was in development at the time, known as Onimusha Warlords. Or more specifically, a fun glitch that game's dev team was sharing around Capcom's offices. See, Onimusha at one point had what was probably a collision detection bug that cropped up while it was being made, which allowed the player to launch enemies flying up into the air. Hideki Kamiya, the director of Devil May Cry 1, saw this and instantly went back to his team and announced that he wanted this implemented into their game, not as a bug, but as a feature. This actually ended up working really well, not only for the fact that the game's melee combat now allowed for fighting game-like air juggles, but it was also something that blended seamlessly into the title's gunplay too, creating that iconic visual of Dante launching an enemy into the air and keeping them suspended with a hailstorm of bullets, something that became a huge part of the game's marketing push.
Capcom.
This has also created a core part of DMC's identity throughout the series, but that's something we'll get into a little bit momentarily, as our arsenal of moves in the beginning is a little sparse right now, but will open up greatly by the end of Mission 2. And before Mission 2 comes Mission 1, a fairly simple endeavour, but one that's executed very well. Despite being a fast-paced action game, DMC 1 actually starts very slow and atmospheric. Clearly, those Resident Evil origins are already showing themselves, but this also greatly serves the purposes of gameplay. Something that can be very easily forgotten is that even as late as the PS2, many studios were still trying out various different control schemes for traversing within a 3D space. And with dual analog sticks now being mandatory on all PS2 controllers, it meant that many players would probably still need to be introduced slowly to the basic controls. Now, Devil May Cry 1's controls, and especially its camera, are things that have aged like milk over the years, especially when you're playing the original PS2 version, which has a very weird button layout that's all over the place. Personally, I think that the controls don't really take all that long to adapt to, and that while the camera can definitely be annoying at times, the pros easily outweigh the cons. See, while Devil May Cry doesn't use pre-rendered backgrounds like the games it was built from, it does use predetermined camera angles, and these are not always particularly ideal. Partly due to some less than optimal placements at times, but also because this style of camera was designed specifically to work in tandem with tank controls, something that DMC has done away with, resulting in many awkward readjustments when transitioning from camera shot to camera shot. Your mileage may vary with this, because personally I'm not particularly bothered by it, but I can see the drawbacks, and I do realise that it drives some people up the bloody wall, even in later games where various things are in place to make it less jarring. We wander down this pathway into the castle via this grandiose foyer, and we can't progress any further until we've collected 45 red orbs, the game's currency, so we can break this barrier that's stopping us. And as luck would have it, there's 45 red orbs in this very room. We just need to find them. This section may seem tedious by today's standards, and it kind of is, but these rorbs, as we'll call them, are spread out across some relatively hard to reach places. And if we want to get them, then we're going to need to familiarise ourselves with Devil May Cry's basic platforming mechanics. Now, in the DMC games, jumping in of itself is a little bit weird. You're able to tap and hold the buttons for various jump heights just like you'd expect. But like an old school Castlevania, there's no readjustment of momentum mid-air unless you use one of the game's free double jumps. Something that needs to be mentioned, however, is there's a sort of horizontal limit to how far Dante can actually travel with any one given jump. The typical logic of getting to higher ground so you can try and jump further is just not a thing in this game, and it's important that the player gets used to this since they'll need to readjust how they play to accommodate. This is an area where one would think, due to the kind of jankiness to it, has aged pretty badly and been phased out of the series over time, but funnily enough, while other things like aerial maneuvers and even inertia have been added in future games, the jump itself has been left largely unchanged. The other two jumps that we need to be acquainted with are the wall hike, a double jump that can be performed when rubbing up against pretty much any vertical surface, and the long jump, a move that can only really be performed in some pseudo-scripted locations, at least for now. These rorbs are not the only goodies that can be found here, however. There's a near unmissable yellow orb, or yorb, just as you start the level, which acts as the game's life system. If you die, you'll have to restart the mission, but if you have a yorb on hand, you'll spend it so you can go back to a checkpoint instead. The other, much more enticing collectible, however, is the blue orb fragments, essentially this game's pieces of heart from Zelda. You collect 4 of them, you make a full blorb, and in doing so, you increase your maximum health. And they even put one right in plain sight for you, so you'll be able to easily grab it once you've gathered all the red orbs and know how to do a wall hike properly. And something that I quite like is that there is a permanently missable blue orb fragment right at the beginning of the game. You'll only know to get if you instinctively jump onto this small bridge. It's something of a easy instant reward for your second playthrough, since by that point you're most definitely going to realise that you can jump up here. But on a first playthrough, unless you've got what I like to call Belmont vision and you know how the wall hike mechanic works ahead of time, you're probably going to miss it. What's more, if you know where to look or just really take your time exploring, you're actually able to be rewarded with your first max health upgrade before encountering a single enemy. And speaking of which, after collecting our orbs and spending them to unlock the barrier, we head through it and up the stairs where we encounter our first enemy type, the marionettes, that while dormant do kinda stand out like a hidden lever on a cartoon bookcase. We jump through a hole in the ceiling and discover that one has a rusty key in its possession. We take it and leave, and oh, suddenly it's awake and we have our first small combat encounter. Now, the mannequins by themselves are not really threats, they're the game's cannon fodder enemy that you can practice combos on. They do have a variety of health values and moves based on their colour, and can even parry you, which is quite impressive compared to other games' combo dummy mobs, but realistically, you're still going to outperform them so much that they're not really dangerous unless they're in groups. Either way, we can quickly dispatch these bloody puppets without too much effort, and we head back down into the foyer where we can use our newly acquired key on the other door to head deeper into the castle, which brings us to the room with the biplane in it. Remember this, it will be important later. We head down through a secret entrance in the back of the room where we'll have our first fight with marionettes in a large group. Luckily, this scuffle is also paired with a wide open arena to ease you into such an encounter, a good example of gradually increasing the intensity of this tutorial level to get the player up to speed. For whatever reason, killing all of the puppets in here will activate the ones in the previous room, so we head back up, kill these others, and proceed through the door and bring ourselves to the end of mission 1. We start mission 2 in a hallway, and down at one end, Dante gets to experience his second impalement of the game, as it just wouldn't be a Devil May Cry game without at least one. Luckily, being British, Dante is used to this sort of thing by now, and he knows that the best way to deal with your average Londoner is to just power move your way through the pain and to stab them back faster. And with this, we get our shiny new sword called Alistair. We then head through the door next to us into the library, where we get a new key and the game's second ranged weapon, the sawn-off shotgun. From here, we can head back into the hallway and down to the other end of the corridor into a small study that holds a goddess of time and space statue. This acts as a shop to purchase new moves as well as permanent upgrades to our health and newly acquired devil trigger meter. The reason why I've held off talking about the specifics of combat until now is because Alistair and Dante's starting weapon, the Force Edge, actually share the same base moveset, except Alistair comes with a whole plethora of extra attacks that you can unlock and use. Now, the absolute basic of basic moves that you have at your disposal is a simple 3-hit combo on the ground and a launcher known as High Time, which can be performed by holding down the lock-on button, pulling away from the enemy with the analog stick and pressing attack. Just tapping the button will launch the enemy like the previously mentioned Onimusha glitch, so you can then combo and juggle them in the air, but holding down the button will make it so Dante will rise up with the enemy, leading to some airborne options such as his Helm Splitter move, a mighty cleave that brings both Dante and his foe back down to the floor. Seems very basic, and it is. Even DMC 2 starts with more moves than the selection DMC 1 provides, but there are actually 2 more options already before we even start shopping, and one of them is hinted at via the new mechanic that Alistair brings within itself. Devil Trigger is a powered up state which can be activated when you have 3 or more of these little pips underneath your health bar filled up, and once done so, it will temporarily boost Dante's attack, defense, and movement speed, as well as giving him some light super armor to tank through attacks. It can also get some unique moves that are only usable in this state, but in DMC 1 it actually has another effect that can go unnoticed. And that is when mashing the attack button in the DT state, your typical 3-hit combo is actually replaced with an overall better 5-hit one instead. This is actually a hint towards Alistair's Combo B, an alternate string of sword swings that can be performed by delaying the 3rd move in your attack string for just a fraction of a second. This is technically a tiny bit of a slower combo, but it does deal more damage and builds up more style. Then there's Combo C, which can be performed via a slightly longer pause in the combo that allows Dante to perform the first incarnation of his Million Stabs move, a combo that takes even longer to perform and thus is even more riskier to pull off in the heat of battle, but one that pierces through enemies blocking. It's not much, but this simple mechanic of delay combos adds a minor but constant mental stack when fighting, and it's just enough to discourage nothing but mindless button mashing and to actually engage the player. Having just these 3 separate ground combos may seem a little underwhelming by today's standards, but this is just the base toolset that we're working with. When we add into the equation the guns and all of the abilities from the shop that you can buy, and how every single tool in your arsenal can work in tandem with each other, it means that the depths of possibilities can grow exponentially. It's why I like that pre-canned sentences versus individual words and phrases analogy that I made earlier. Each new word that becomes available ends up giving you so much more freedom than just that one particular word gives you by itself. And each new move grants more of an ability to create custom combos than the last. And by today's character action game standards, doing something like a short combo into a launcher, into a juggle combo, into a second launcher, into a helm splitter is pretty basic, but I think there is beauty in this simplicity here. Not only was the genre itself trying to find its place in the medium at the time, but it also works as an excellent onboarding process for beginners of the subgenre. And thanks to it being relatively simple compared to its contemporaries, it has the benefit of being able to demand the player to actually engage with all of its mechanics. Like many games, you don't necessarily need to understand every aspect of the game to actually complete it, and with later DMC games, this is especially true. There's so many moves in DMC3 onwards that are less optimal or even bad, but exist there to make you feel cool. It's just fun having them there, but they are ultimately, from a mechanical purpose, somewhat redundant. DMC1's more limited toolset still offers enough for player expression within the game's combat, but it's not so much that there's too many redundancies that start popping up. So while there is less room for overall player expression within the game, it does a better job at actually teaching the player how to engage with it, and therefore is actually more likely to cause player expression. Every move has its purpose. Combos A through C are just different flavours of general combo filler, your bread and butter to every combo if you will, whilst High Time is your launcher and go-to combo extender. Stinger, the first move that you'll likely buy for your weapon, is a single heavy stab that can travel long distances, and it can be used as a gap closer, but it's more intentionally designed to be a sort of combo ender, thanks to its high single hit damage and the fact that it's got really strong knockdown potential against smaller enemies that usually ends up pushing them away. Round Trip is a boomerang-like sword throw that allows you to deal with two enemies who are apart from each other at the same time, either by using your guns while it's spinning around or using its pretty weak punch-kick combo. This one is unfortunately a little bit hard to use properly and is fairly limiting, barring one special case that we'll talk about later when we get to the second weapon. Finally, we have Vortex and Air Raid, which allow for actual, if a little unruly, aerial combat. You still have less moves than on the ground, and it does require DT to actually use, but the options are there, especially if you get good at turning Dante's flying state on and off. Vortex is a corkscrew melee attack that homes in on an enemy, and Air Raid allows you to channel Emperor Palpatine, making for a powerful and safe way of dealing with enemies from a distance at the cost of some inefficient use of your DT gauge. Ebony and Ivory actually do quite a bit of damage compared to later games, but are still primarily used for three things: keeping enemies suspended in the air, keeping Dante suspended in the air, and keeping your style gauge active while you reposition. The first two things have their obvious benefits. Keeping enemies launched looks cool and also keeps them stunned for longer, and keeping Dante airborne means it's harder for enemies to actually hit you. The third use is one that's actually pretty unique to this game, as DMC1's style meter acts pretty differently compared to future titles. Starting with DMC3, the style ranking becomes more of a way for the game to judge your general performance in any given combat encounter. The more you hit the enemy and the more you vary up your attacks, the higher it will go. Doing nothing will slowly cause the style ranking to decay, and getting hit will instantly drop you down a few ranks. In DMC1, however, the style gauge works more like a traditional combo counter in a fighting game. Inactivity doesn't make it slowly disappear, it instantly vanishes within less than a second of not doing anything. And to maintain it, you are required to string together various attacks and combos together via animation cancelling or just performing them back to back. And this is where Ebony and Ivory come in really handy. You may find that many of your combos or special moves usually end with you knocking an enemy just out of reach, meaning that your style rank will disappear. You can always stinger your way to an enemy, but doing so will usually knock them down again and make it harder to actually follow up with anything. Ebony and Ivory's bullets become stale after only 2 or 3 shots, but if used on an enemy who has been launched into the air, you're able to maintain that rank for a sizable amount of time. And while this in of itself was mainly just put into the game to be cool, it does also serve a mechanical purpose of being the only way to allow Dante to freely reposition himself while not letting that style meter drain, as you're able to slowly strafe around when using guns, and this is the key to reaching and maintaining that elusive S rank, which you'll want to do both to achieve the self-satisfaction of playing well, but also the bonus red orbs that you'll receive both while fighting and at the end of the mission for defeating enemies at higher ranks. But you won't be able to do this for long or super often unless you mix in some actual sword combos in between them, meaning that the game's limited nature really enforces that you need to know how to string your combos out in advance, and it won't just let you go ham and do whatever. You can also use the other two more obvious, albeit less useful methods of maintaining style, being a single taunt or dodge roll. Both of them only buy you a second at most to allow enemies to get close to you, so how useful they are is very situational and based on the current layout of the arena. This, however, is their secondary function, and both of them are incredibly useful at what they're supposed to do. The dodge roll allows you to cancel out of attack animations and move very quickly to one side. It also has invincibility frames, so you can use it to dodge through attacks opposed to just away from them. One thing that a lot of newcomers to DMC don't realise is that the jump has iframes as well, meaning that you should be far more concerned with timing your dodge perfectly than actually inputting the dodge command correctly. The taunt, on the other hand, is something that's excellent at building devil trigger gauge, which is something you'll want to be using very liberally. See, based on many other games, you'd think that the big powerful super mode is something that you'd only really want to use in big important fights, but between its really fast recharge time and surprisingly potent healing factor, it's actually something you'll want to be using as often as possible, especially when the only other healing options available are green orbs, which are dropped by enemies via RNG, and vital stars, which are expensive and lower your rank, which will only make things more difficult down the road. Besides, every pro gamer knows that if you want the true DMC experience, then you'll avoid using items like the Plague, barring one or two less fun sequences. Taunting allows you to refill a large chunk of Devil Trigger meter without actually damaging any of the enemies in the arena, greatly increasing just how often you can use DT when battling foes, so that healing can really go the distance. It also acts as an excellent bit of ludonarrative harmony, as it encourages you to start fighting in a way befitting of Dante himself. It's not quite on the same level as something like Virgil's concentration bar in DMC4, but it's still there to make you play with your food just like Dante would. After all, DMC1, with its roots as a potential Resident Evil 4, was originally designed as a survival horror game, with the only difference being that you're not the one trying to survive. Finally, we have the shotgun, which Dante fires and reloads with one hand because, and I quote, "doing so with two hands just wouldn't be cool." And of course, it works about as well as you'd expect, dealing very good damage up close, but having a pretty significant drop off after a couple of meters. Its real purpose within the gameplay loop, however, is its impact force and stopping power, which makes it an excellent tool for stopping or knocking down whatever enemies are coming at you, as well as launching them even higher into the air after a high time. Now, I may have gone into way too much detail breaking down all of the nitty-gritty parts of DMC1's core combat so far, but I really need to stress that this is only covering the full moveset of one set of weapons. There's a whole assortment of demonic weaponry that we haven't gotten to yet, nor have we gone over the advanced hidden mechanics and glitches in the game that really take it to another level. The point I really want to make here is that many Devil May Cry fans give the first game a bit of a cold shoulder these days, claiming that while it is good in its own right, it doesn't really hold a candle to the complexity of 3 onwards, and it's hard to go back to. And while the statement about the overall complexity is certainly true, there's no denying that, I feel like the follow-up of it being hard to go back to is a little disingenuous, since DMC1 still has crazy amounts of depth that we'll be getting into. And I don't believe for a second that the majority of players who claim that DMC1 is hard to go back to are actually good enough to be anywhere near touching that skill ceiling. I know I'm certainly not. That skill ceiling may be lower than future titles, but it's still pretty damn high, and I think that the comparative simplicity of Devil May Cry 1 is actually one of its greatest strengths more than it is a weakness. As I said before, while the game doesn't have as many moves and mechanics, it expects you to actually engage with them more. So depending on how you look at it, while it might have a lower skill ceiling, it could arguably have a higher skill floor. Because while the game can become incredibly easy when you know every single little trick and secret, up until that point, it can be very brutal. It does, however, have a much more gradual difficulty curve. So overall, your experience with DMC1 is going to help you more down the line with other character action games than the other games might. Devil May Cry 1 is not only a great introduction for the series, but also its entire subgenre. And had it truly aged poorly over the years, I don't think I'd be able to say that. Take the original Metroid, for example. I'd probably not recommend it to someone who was trying to get into Metroidvanias, nor would I recommend Street Fighter 1 or Karate Champ for fighting games. But I definitely would, and actively am, doing so for DMC1. There's also the fact that DMC1, even now, has aspects to its gameplay that are wholly unique to it within the character action subgenre. There's a whole bunch of intentionally obscure game design, as well as some genuine bugs that unlock the ability to perform these advanced advanced or hidden mechanics that, once exploited, really crack the game wide open. We've gone over the combat a lot so far, so we'll circle back to this once we've gotten every weapon so we can talk about all of them at once, but a sneak peek at one that's especially useful in the early moments of the game is shotgun twitching. This is a great technique with a pretty low execution barrier that even if you're not perfectly timing it, you can still reap most of the rewards from. While every gun has infinite ammo, one downside to the shotgun is that unlike Ebony and Ivory that pretty much fire as fast as you can mash the button, the shotgun has a reload animation that limits its fire rate. The thing is though, Dante's reload animation is tied to how he's moving. Instead of just animating the top half of his body and the bottom half separately and then blending them together, he has to have a unique animation for reloading when standing still, as well as each of the cardinal directions. What this means is by changing the direction that Dante is moving after a shotgun blast, you will cancel his reload animation and he'll return to just his standard aiming pose. Left strafing Dante who was reloading? Nah, he's old news. It's all about right strafing Dante now. He's the newest hot craze. And since the reloading animation has been cancelled, it means you can shoot again earlier than usual, effectively doubling your fire rate if you've got the right timing and nearly doubling it if you're a little off. The thing is though, you don't even really need to time it, you can kind of just wiggle the stick rapidly in all directions and it'll work. The reason why it's called shotgun twitching is because it can make Dante look like he's got a bit of a nervous twitch going on, something that becomes abundantly clear when you make him kinda spaz out like this when doing it. For now though, I want to get back to talking about the game's world and atmosphere for the next couple of missions, because honestly, in terms of level design and presentation, I actually think that no other game in the series has DMC1 beat. Devil May Cry 2 is very brown and just ugly looking, while 3 has the problem of it mostly taking place within a single tower. They do what they can to try and vary it up a little bit, but it still comes across very samey overall.
Well, that's a switch.
DMC4 comes pretty close in places, but in its unfinished state feels a little half-baked, whilst DMC5 unfortunately loses a few points for many of its locales kind of bleeding into each other, with its two main aesthetics being Modern City and Demon's Nest. The games generally over time also got increasingly more linear, mainly to facilitate faster and faster pacing, but in the process of this also losing a little bit of that original RE charm. And that charm is responsible for some incredibly atmospheric and interconnecting level design. The castle on Malay Island has this eerie supernatural feeling to them that gets increasingly prominent as you realise that the barrier between the human world and the demon world is getting blurrier and blurrier as we go. The castle feels simultaneously very real and very uncanny at the same time, doing an excellent job of generating this general aura of uneasiness to it. Despite its mission-like structure, the game doesn't feel like it's made up of strict video game levels. The world feels very lived in, whilst also having nonsensical things in various places scattered across the island. The castle itself is 12th century in design, but things like a biplane, a shotgun, and a grenade launcher can be found within it. The various libraries and bookcases throughout the game are filled with notes and documents detailing this place's history, as well as testimonies from confused staff members being baffled by the increasingly bizarre modifications and extensions being made to it over the years. There's also a ton of books and symbology that relate to alchemy, which will become more important later with more context. Thanks to an interview with Kamiya, we know that Malay Island is not actually bound to a set location and frequently transports itself from place to place. And personally, I like to think that the island itself is the Bermuda Triangle, and the reason for so many disappearances over the years is due to boats and planes spotting this castle island unmarked on any map and letting curiosity get the better of them and landing there. It would also make a lot of sense that the Gate to Hell exists relatively near Florida. The castle is not just a weird, derelict structure like an overgrown Resident Evil location, there's something otherworldly about it. Paintings take corporeal form, pillars will writhe and pulse as if the stone itself were alive, and the doors themselves will seal you in and grab you for trying to escape. It feels as if even the castle itself is against you, trying to hinder your progress. It's a really small detail, but one of my favourite visual effects in this game that really adds to the atmosphere is this window. Well, actually, this window and one or two others found elsewhere in the game. I love them. Essentially, all this window is literally just a texture of a high frame rate GIF instead of a JPEG or PNG. It has no real depth to the effect as to distinguish between the window frame and the trees behind it, and it's not particularly exciting or impressive if looked solely through a modern lens, but video games have always been and always will be a combination of smoke and mirrors, and on original hardware and a CRT this would look incredible. Due to the fixed predetermined cameras and the fact that it only takes up a relatively small part of the screen, it means that you only really see it from one angle. So luckily you're unable to look at it from various different positions to see how flat it actually is. And due to the nature of it being just a pre-rendered video pasted onto the wall, it means that the tree bustling in the wind can be far more detailed and complexly animated than anything a real-time rendered 3D model could achieve at the time, or hell, arguably even today. One argument that you could make, however, is that the game now being in HD does kind of spoil the effect. You can see through the illusion much more easily than the original game, and that seeing it in 1080p or higher does kind of ruin the original look that the game was trying to convey. It's like when you watch Korn in 4K and you can now see all the surgery scars. But surprisingly, this is one of the areas that I think the HD remaster hasn't spoiled, and it's one of those areas that I think represents the idea of aging like milk and becoming a fancy cheese instead. It now looks inherently kind of weird and uncanny in how we perceive it, and even if it's unintended, the window itself adds these further hints to the fact that the island itself is fundamentally wrong and demonic in nature. Not only does it look visually impressive in the context of the era that the game was made in, but with just a little bit of pretentious overanalyzing and mental gymnastics, it also has this extra little bonus bit of additional world building that really adds to the game's presentation. Speaking of which, I think that visually, in a lot of ways, DMC1 actually still blows DMC3 out of the water. Now, DMC3 is by no means an ugly game, unless we're talking about that main menu that's literally just two PNGs on a white background. In fact, in terms of character models and animations, Devil May Cry 3 definitely has DMC1 beat. But I feel like this is the case for two reasons. One is obviously that the two games came out at each bookend of the console generation, and over time, devs just got better and more efficient at utilizing the tools that they have available. So while I think that DMC1 has aged better overall, at any given moment it's had more time to age. But the second reason is that DMC1 spends a lot of its resources on more subtle additions. Even something like a simple corridor will have stuff like fake volumetric light pouring through the windows and a ton of extra detail to the environmental modeling between things like paintings, statues and curtains, etc. And while the overall color palette is still very much overpowering with the same sort of greys and browns to invoke that gothic tone, the extra details means that there's a wider range of colours within that colour grading, resulting in just more variants of those greys and browns. DMC3 on the other hand has much more flat looking areas, with details having to rely on simply being textured in, even with the advantage of the game being much newer. You could argue that I'm cherry picking here, but in both cases I scrubbed through the footage of a full playthrough to find two similar basic looking rooms. DMC3 does have areas that are much more visually distinctive and impressive, but so does DMC1. And when I think over all of those areas where DMC3 is the most memorable, it's when they really lean in on making the most of that empty space to leave a striking image on the mind. Something that DMC1 is able to do as well when it wants to, since it's just a less is more style aesthetic. It's just able to do so much more outside of that as well. Neither method is inherently good or bad, as they both have their strengths and weaknesses. Part of the reason for DMC1's particularly iffy camera is because of the scenery. Having all of those extra pillars or slight inclines in the ground can mess and interfere with the camera and combat quite a bit. So it's not like these visuals don't come at a price. But I feel like if there is one thing that we can almost all unanimously agree on, is that DMC1 does have some of the best environmental design in the series. As pretty much everything in this video is just talking about how DMC1 is not better or worse than the modern titles, just fundamentally different and able to coexist with them without being overshadowed by its newer iterations. Now, Mission 3 is a pretty significant one, as it's our first taste at a boss fight against Phantom, a giant spider demon filled with magma. In fact, providing you don't go hunting for blob fragments, pretty much the entirety of this mission consists of crossing from one end of the bridge to the other and then fighting the boss. Since they knew that this would be the player's first experience with a boss fight and wanted to give them the opportunity to focus solely on him. There are technically these skeleton skulls that exist at the bottom of the bridge when it collapses, but they all die to a single close range shotgun blast and will only aggro to you when you get close to them, so it's such a non-issue. Hell, you even get what is essentially a full heal after beating them. Phantom is a little bit of a difficult boss for me to demonstrate on normal, since a lot of his fight is designed around him being hard, but only provided that you're scared of him. So if you know what you're doing even remotely, you can handle him with ease with just a bit of brute force, but if you really know what you're doing, then you can completely tear him apart. That being said, if you're a bit dubious to take him head on, then you give Phantom more than enough opportunity to start giving you some trouble. If you keep your distance, he'll shoot fireballs that come at you very quickly and cause pillars of lava to rise out of the ground, which force you to stay on the move rather than attacking him in order to avoid them. But when you're up close, the only thing he really has is a couple of different well-telegraphed claw swipes that are really easy to dodge. The only other moves he really has is a command grab that will ruin your day if you're not careful, and a big slam attack that he can use to reposition and reorient himself. His various legs act as shields, so if you want to attack him, you pretty much have to just get right up in his face, which naturally puts you in direct line of fire. The game's not going to let you hug his ass like it's a Dark Souls boss. You can, however, jump onto his back and start attacking him from a much safer position, and even use Helm Splitter on his tail for massive damage. The coolest thing about this fight, however, is you can knock his fireballs back at him with a well-timed attack, or even cause them to explode in his mouth if you fight aggressively enough. Either way, this big lava spider tries to boil us alive and eat us, but unfortunately for him, he doesn't realise that we taste best when cooked al dente, so he has to escape through the floor to fight another day. And by another day, I mean immediately as you start Mission 4. Well, not necessarily, because as soon as Mission 4 starts, we can actually double back into the cathedral to encounter our first secret mission. And yeah, maybe Phantom being pissed with us makes a lot of sense. Secret missions are these little bonus gimmick challenges that you can do in exchange for extra blue orb fragments, and at this point are a staple of the franchise. They are also, however, designed to introduce the player to hidden mechanics and teach them how to get the most out of the gameplay systems without explicitly telling them. In DMC 1, this is especially important because Dante's original design was to see him as a bit of a trickster, the sort of person who would wow people at the bar with various sleights of hand, and this game in particular has a lot of these special tricks that you can do. They're these almost cinematic ways of dealing the finishing blow that allow you to take down enemies in a fraction of the time it would do putting them down normally. And Secret Mission Uno is the best example of this, as the mission explicitly states that there is a way to defeat the Sin Scissors enemy within a single hit. This is a godsend to know, because fighting them without this trick makes them a real pain in the ass to deal with. Since these spectral stylists are ghosts, it means that they can phase through walls, allowing them to retreat beyond Dante's reach, and they're quite resilient as their large scissors will often be able to block or parry your attacks. If you don't know what you're doing, there's quite a lot of waiting as you try and find an opening, and they can be very frustrating to fight, especially if you're in an arena that is a small enclosed room like a corridor. Fortunately, they have a pretty long and obvious wind-up to all of their attack animations, and therein lies the key. If you strike as one of these attacks are about to come out, the two of you will clash and bounce off of each other, but the Sin Scissors will be staggered and on the back foot for longer, giving you just a few seconds where they're vulnerable. During this time, you can quickly run to their side to line up a shot directly with their skull and pop them with a single blast from your shotgun. Technically this will work with any of the guns, but personally I find using the shotgun to be more consistent and ultimately more satisfying. It just feels right, you know? But this is the introduction to the critical hit mechanic, a way of instantly killing multiple different enemies by meeting certain conditions. The second one that the game introduces you to is a method of easily taking out shadows, a sort of panther-like mini-boss that is scattered throughout the game. Secret Mission 4 requires you to take on 3 of these guys all at the same time, and while it doesn't explicitly tell you about its critical hit mechanic, it does set you up to be more likely to find it in this mission thanks to its large open arena. Shadows are by default immune to physical attacks, and trying to swing your sword at them will cause you to bounce off of them. On hard mode and upwards, they'll even spark and counter you if you try to do so. So the natural course of action is to just shoot at them with your guns while avoiding their onslaught of attacks. After doing this for a bit, their core will be exposed, and you'll be able to run up and slash away at them. If you deal enough damage to the core, they'll start glowing red and go into this desperation state where they'll repeatedly try and command grab you and self-destruct. If you're able to avoid this for long enough, they'll eventually just blow up from a safe distance. One attack that they're more likely to execute when far away, which is why the big arena in this secret mission helps, is one where they charge up and fire a skewer that shoots out several meters in a sort of pseudo-projectile. The thing is, this attack stays out and lingers for a few seconds, and the skewer itself actually has collision. So what you can do is avoid it by jumping straight up and actually landing on the skewer itself. If done correctly, you'll have about a second or two to start unloading a hail of bullets from ebony and ivory. This essentially pierces the outer shell and hits the core directly, and doing so puts them in that red desperation mode instantly. And while it's not a mandatory tactic for dealing with Secret Mission 4, taking on 3 shadows at the same time is no easy task, and having this trick under your belt will greatly even the odds. There are more examples still to talk about, and they will actually fill into the game's Beastiary if you accidentally perform them, but for now we'll keep moving forward and I'll cover each critical hit for the enemies that have them as they're introduced. The other reason Mission 4 is so special is that it is the introduction to the Black Angel himself, Nelo Angelo. Men will look at this image and think to themselves, hell yeah. Nelo Angelo is this game's rival character, and he is perfect. The man's got aura, he's got swag, and he's got one of the best introduction cutscenes of all time.
This stinking hole was the last place I thought I'd find anyone with some guts.
Now, the thing that makes Nelo Angelo really cool is he's not just a rival boss because he's a difficult humanoid opponent, it's because he has your moveset. His basic damage dealing combo is basically your combo B. He also has a high time into Helmbreaker combo, as well as not one, but 2, technically 3, stingers. One of them being a stab, with 2 of them being a slash with a giant hitbox. He even has a projectile in the form of a charged fireball that may look familiar later on. And to top it all off, this motherfucker taunts you whenever he knocks you down or if you're trying to lame it out too much. Between all of this and the fact that his sword is quite frankly much bigger than yours, he quite literally fits into the I'm you but stronger category of boss, and it's sick. Your only respite, besides you and Dante having a human element to your fighting, is Nelo's overconfidence results in him taunting you after many of his combos, as well as the fact that most of his attacks have very long windups, allowing you to adjust properly. If you play aggressively and time your strikes right, you're able to capitalize on every opening he leaves you, and even parry and stun his ass whenever he tries to fight back. If even little child Kraftium can beat him, I know you can. It's one of the simplest but best boss fights in gaming, who will kick your ass to hell and back on your first time playing, and even does so in the cutscene. The only reason Dante is able to survive is because Nelo can't handle that sick drip. And the best part is this is the easy baby mode version of him. He only gets tougher in rounds 2 and 3. Speaking of which, since it's something I've failed to mention so far, let's talk about DMC1's easy mode. The game doesn't actually give you a choice, it throws you into normal right off the bat whether you like it or not. And the ability to play easy mode is only unlocked after certain requirements have been met. Basically, you just have to play really badly in any of the first 3 missions. Naturally, as a pro gamer, I have not unlocked easy mode. But I've always really liked this about DMC 1 and 3, as it creates this fun psychological dynamic between you and the game. It doesn't even tell you that there is an easy mode, not until you've died enough times and the game decides to throw you a bone, displaying those 5 oh so infamous words that are so emotionally damaging that even a devil may cry.
And he's got that, and that is the end. Oh! God damn it!
The funny thing about this is, it's not even demeaning, it's not mocking, it's not berating the player in any shape or form, it's simply stating that, hey, you seem to be struggling a little bit, feel free to take this little handicap. And yet, due to this message immediately following a player death, its impact stings so incredibly bad, making, 90% of players feel insulted and igniting that drive to do better to prove that stupid message wrong. And it's able to do this without feeling particularly mean-spirited about it. That being said, I'm not a huge fan of DMC 1's easy mode in of itself, mostly because it's not just easy mode, it's easy automatic mode. Something that would later be split into 2 separate things, with the latter being a toggle that would be available on all difficulties in future titles. Easy mode is pretty much what you'd expect, you deal more and take less damage. And honestly, this is perfectly fine for a struggling player to try and get to grips with the game. Personally, if it was up to me, I'd just leave the damage that the player deals the same as normal and just make Dante tankier, since on easy, enemies die so quickly that you don't really get to do many combos on them, but it is what it is. It's the automatic part that I have a problem with. Its main feature is it makes Dante perform basic combos automatically just by pressing the attack button in different contexts. If you're locked onto an enemy who's really far away from you and you press the attack button, you'll automatically just stinger over to them. Alternatively, if you're pretty close but still slightly out of range, you'll automatically do a high time because its hitbox is slightly longer. And if you're up close and personal, you'll do something like the first 2 hits of your default combo into a high time, into a helm splitter, into a stinger. The game will generate a simple combo for you. It kind of makes the gameplay a little bit like Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2, which are great games in their own right, but this system really hampers DMC's combat because A, it's not really built for that, and B, it gets in the way of one of the main appeals of DMC's combat to begin with. With automatic on, the game will now actively fight whatever inputs you're putting in for what it assumes is the best option in that moment, and it just takes control away from the player in a really unfun way. And this is a problem I have with automatic mode in all of the DMC games. As an accessibility feature, it's pretty good. I mean, if you're playing with one arm and a foot controller or something, you're already fighting an uphill battle at that point. And there's gonna be some execution barriers that you're just probably not going to be able to overcome. But considering the era of these games and the way that the mode's presented in DMC 1, it was definitely not intended to be a accessibility setting and was just an easy mode. And having this setting on for easy mode actually is directly working against kind of what easy mode is supposed to be for this game. And that brings us to the final change that Easy Automatic makes. See, this mode is kinda designed to be a sort of training run through the game, since that sort of thing was the style at the time. It was very much expected that after beating the game on easy, the player would then pick up the controller again to play through on normal. Hell, I could even make the argument that normal is a training run for hard or Son of Sparda mode, since that's the intended difficulty and enemy rebalancing that are designed for all of the abilities that you'll have in New Game Plus. But the way that DMC 1's easy mode does this is by hiding a bunch of content from the player. Easy Automatic mode cuts a lot of different enemy types from the game and replaces them with their more basic counterparts from earlier missions. And I'm of 2 minds on this. On one hand, it is pretty cool that an unknowing player who jumps onto normal after beating it once on easy is gonna see these new enemy types and have this moment of going, wait, how much else did the game hide from me? And it's like you've got an entirely new experience. But on the other hand, most players, especially these days, and especially if they've played the easy automatic mode that's just not as fun, will likely just move on to the next game once they've finished DMC 1 for the first time, and that'll end up devaluing their experience. It's kind of a double-edged sword. So for DMC 1 in particular, for anyone and anyone, I would recommend just sticking to normal mode. Using items like vital stars and such basically already is a sort of pseudo-easy mode. Though I'd avoid buying any in the actual shop since they get increasingly more expensive, and if you do, you kind of fall into this loop of just buying items instead of new moves, and therefore you do worse in combat encounters, which means that you have to buy more items to get through them, and it just gets a little bit messy overall. You can see why they changed things later down the line. Luckily, there are a ton of these items that are really easy to find in DMC 1 if you do a little bit of exploring, so you don't necessarily have to buy items. Now, we're only about 9,000 words in, and despite all of my yapping, we're still only on mission 4. Luckily, the next 4 missions don't have too much new going on in them, so we can speed through them fairly quickly. Although, if you're still here 50 minutes into the video, I'm pretty sure I've got you for the long haul. And if that is the case and you are enjoying yourself, then please like, subscribe, and all that other jazz. This video's taken a lot of work, and it'd be really cool and or sexy of you if you do. Now, the reasons why missions 5 through 8 will be pretty easy to blitz right through is because outside of a few rooms and puzzles and 1 or 2 enemy types, pretty much everything we see here is stuff that's already been in earlier missions. This section of the game has quite a few very simple get from point A to point B style missions, having you wander around the halls of the castle with each new key that you've acquired in the previous one. Mission 5 just asks you to take out a single shadow mini-boss enemy and then to go through 3 doors. You are given a time limit, but it is very generous. Mission 6 has us travel through the castle sewers, the go-to area for least interesting video game level of all time, and DMC 1 is no exception. We are, however, introduced to a new enemy type as well as a new mini-boss in this level. The Beelzebubs, as you might expect from the name, are these insect fly-like enemies. They're probably DMC 1's shortest-lived enemy type, since they barely show up in the game outside of this mission and don't leave much of an impression when they are here either. They are, however, actually one of the enemy types that have a critical hit kill, which can be performed by using the Helm Splitter on them after you've knocked them on their back, but honestly, just spamming the shotgun works just as well and is significantly safer, and seeing them explode into multiple different pieces just has a very satisfying feel to it. The mini-boss that we encounter down here is the Death Scissors, and this was a roadblock for young 7-8-year-old Kraft back in the day that he never got past. This was my noob wall. The Death Scissors are basically just a amped up version of their Sin Scissor sisters. Their general moveset and traits are very similar, but they have a few distinct differences. Firstly, they'll put up this barrier and lock you into a small enclosed arena that allows them to escape your reach quite often. They'll also intermittently become invulnerable and start using Psycho Crushers at you from every possible angle, which, due to them being able to phase through the wall, is usually from a direction that you just can't see coming. This is what really screwed me over as a kid because it does a lot of damage, and the only way to really dodge it is based off timing. You can't rely on reacting to the attack because it might be coming out of the floor, so you've got to learn to space your jumps and dodge rolls down to a very specific rhythm. Other than all of this, they're basically just a more tanky version of the Sin Scissors that don't have the insta-kill method, which is why they can be pretty tough to deal with, but funnily enough, the barrier that they put up can actually work to your advantage. See, there's a hidden property to the Helm Splitter that makes it deal extra damage after performing any kind of double jump. Essentially, the higher you are, the more damage you'll do. And this can be from air hiking, enemy stepping, or wall hiking, which is something that we can do off of the Death Scissors barriers. This enclosed arena makes sure that no matter where we are, even if we haven't bought the air hike ability, we'll always be able to get a double jump off. And when you pair and stack this damage buff with Devil Trigger, this mini-boss variant can go down almost as quick as the regular Sin Scissors. Mission 7, like 5, doesn't have anything particularly new in it. We basically just have another take key from point A to point B within the time limit mission again. The only difference being that instead of the time limit being a counting down clock, it is your health slowly draining away. There is, however, notably a secret mission that unlocks in this stage that puts you up against a new enemy type, the Cyclops. But you're unlikely to actually do it during Mission 7 since it's already pretty slow and frustrating at the best of times, and having slowly draining health does not help it. The enemies themselves are actually pretty basic. They're just smaller versions of Phantom with a earth element instead of fire. And while that does seem pretty intimidating for an ordinary enemy type, you can still take them down pretty easily. Their heavy weight does mean that you can't juggle them in any shape or form, and they don't really have any unique gimmicks to them either. I'd say that they still have a purpose within the sandbox, adding variety if nothing else, but like the Beelzebubs, these are one of the least common enemy types, so they don't leave that much of an impression. The most notable thing about them is this secret mission that asks you to make one of them kill the other. This is to teach you that enemies can in fact hurt each other, and it's something that you can see with the shotguns on the marionettes at times. Unfortunately, this isn't a very useful or reliable way of dealing with enemies because you just have to jump around waiting for the AI and its RNG to kick in and do the right move. And in this particular secret mission, these enemies have quite a bit of health relative to the attacks that can hurt each other. So you have to jump around for a long time wondering if it's even working to begin with. And it doesn't help that they can actually knock each other out of bounds by clipping themselves through the floor, which means that you just have to start the mission over. Luckily, you can just come back after you've finished the mission and do it then. Mission 8 is our final showdown with Phantom. He's been trying to chase us down throughout the castle ever since our first encounter with him, and you can either run away from these or you can stand your ground to earn some extra orbs. And on hard mode and upwards, you can actually run into him as a random encounter if you stray off the beaten path. There's no cutscene or fanfare or anything, he just shows up like the Majima Everywhere system. This time round he's a little bit tougher and has one or two different moves in his arsenal, but I actually think it's a little bit easier to fight him, as this time round we're in a smaller but overall less annoying arena as it's completely flat. His biggest key difference is he now has a move where he fires a bunch of fireballs into the air which then rain down upon Dante. Mechanically it's very similar to the fire column move, but with it coming down much faster and dealing a lot more damage, it is a scarier attack to have to deal with. The plus side of this is that it does cause him to get tired afterwards, giving you a good opportunity to get in there and deal some really good damage. The other main difference with this fight is this is the one boss fight in the entire game that has a insta-kill mechanic like some of its lesser enemies. After defeating Phantom, he recoils in pain and falls through the glass floor in the center of the arena, falling onto the horseman statue in the main hallway at the beginning of the game, Dio Brando style. This is followed by him cursing Dante, asking him how it's possible for a human to have a dick this big since only Sparda had a member so long, until eventually realizing who and what Dante is before ultimately melting away forever. Or, you know, until the next game. However, if you're an eagle-eyed player, you may notice that if Phantom does his big slam attack during the fight and happens to land on that big glass circle in the center of the arena, the texture of the glass will actually change to make it look like it's cracked. It is a little hard to notice in the middle of the actual fight with how ornate and busy the detailing on the window texture actually is, but it is a hint to a hidden way of killing Phantom. By making him land on the glass 5 times, this will instantly trigger the end of fight cutscene, albeit with the first second of Phantom recoiling in pain cut off. And it actually means you can beat him without even hitting him once. It's actually a surprisingly easy move to bait out, making this fight an absolute cakewalk. And something I did for my Dante Must Die playthrough since I needed to get footage for it anyway. But with that, we make sure to check if any girls were watching us do the cool thing and head down into the drawbridge room to grab a trident, which is our key out of the castle and to the rest of the island, as well as a new, incredibly overpowered weapon, the grenade gun. Because nothing is stronger than an M32 rotary grenade launcher, and it'll be your best friend for taking out demons, especially on your average, casual, normal difficulty playthrough. It does a ton of damage, hard knocks down most enemies, and builds up a load of Devil Trigger with each shot. Its drawbacks being that it is a projectile style weapon instead of hit scan, meaning that it has travel time that you have to accommodate for, giving enemies the chance to dodge it either accidentally or on purpose. It can also only be fired when Dante's feet are firmly planted on the ground and in place. You can't fire it while jumping or moving, and it has a pretty lengthy reload animation. The thing is, however, However, the latter of these issues can be remedied with a similar technique to shotgun twitching called grenade rolling, and this one's probably a little bit more intentional. Like most of your attack animations, you can cancel out of the end of their recovery frames by dodge rolling to the side or jumping. The game allows you to do this to an extent because it doesn't want you reacting to an attack and trying to dodge it and being unable to due to an animation of something that you did before the attack was coming out. Obviously, for balancing purposes, stronger attacks will still have more of a commitment to them, but it's clear that they wanted to mitigate any sort of scenario where it might feel unfair that you got hit. It's in a similar school of thought of having enemies who are off screen be less likely to attack you. The thing with the grenade gun is that the reload animation is significantly longer than the dodge roll animation, and so by rolling left and right between every shot, you're actually speeding up the rate of fire in a weird backwards roundabout way. This also indirectly addresses the downside of needing to stand still and be a sitting duck to fire somewhat, as the rolls side to side do have iframes and also just generally keep you moving, making you just a harder target for the enemy's AI to actually hit. Something that I've also failed to mention is that every single gun that we've acquired so far has a charge shot ability. This essentially allows you to buff the damage of these weapons temporarily by giving them devil trigger damage without actually having to go into that state. I forgot to mention it before because honestly the amount of shots that you get out of charging your guns is kind of pathetic, and unlike later games in the series, you need to be locked on and strafing to be able to actually charge them, so your movement options when charging are somewhat limited. If you have the dexterity in your hands to be able to do combos with your sword while charging your guns, then by all means it's worth doing, but personally for me, the bonus damage I deal to the enemies is not worth the bonus damage I deal to my hand cramp. One thing I do feel is worth mentioning, however, is that the charge shot for the grenade launcher only allows you to fire one charged grenade. But thanks to the increased fire rate from grenade rolling, you can actually squeeze in a second shot per charge, and that is something that I do think is worthwhile. It's funny because when I did my video on the DMC2 Definitive Edition mod, something that attempts to fix the gameplay of that game, I'll leave the link somewhere up on screen if you're interested, I actually got a lot of people defending DMC2 with the argument that guns are actually a lot stronger in DMC1 in comparison, with the grenade gun being the big, obvious, egregious comparison, and told me how the whole guns in Devil May Cry 2 being overpowered argument is a narrative that is disingenuous and tired. Now, these are DMC2 fans and are clinically insane, but they do have a semblance of a point here. But at the same time, I think they also kind of miss the point between what separates the guns in DMC1 and DMC2 and why they're so powerful in each respective game. For starters, the problem with 2 has never been necessarily the raw damage numbers that the guns possess, but the fact that even when slow firing Ebony and Ivory just by holding down the square button, they have the ability to launch enemies up into the air, not just juggle them, but actually launch them up by themselves. Whereas in DMC1, their juggling potential had to be used in tandem with your sword to actually get any use out of them. It's less their damage and more so their stopping power that makes them such a problem in 2's sandbox. But the other thing is that the guns in DMC1 are more balanced in a more intentional perspective. Still a damn sight stronger than they are in 3 onwards, but I'd say how useful they are compared to your swords is maybe about 40-60 or potentially 50-50 if you exploit the game to its absolute fullest. The grenade gun is OP, but its recovery time was a pretty substantial counterbalance to make it fair. It's only because we used techniques like grenade rolling and shotgun twitching, and another one that I'm very fond of that we'll talk about in the advanced techniques section of this video, that makes these guns as strong as they are. And the thing is, while it does unbalance the game somewhat, it does so in a fun and beneficial way to the player that requires just enough technical execution to make it a great boon, but not feel like a free handout. Grenade rolling is not a difficult technique to perform, but it's a damn sight more interesting than just holding down the square button. These tips and tricks can trivialize certain aspects of the game, but they do so in a way that feels rewarding. It feels stronger and cooler at the same time. With Mission 9, we finally leave the castle and watch the drawbridge close behind us. Why? Well, this is a Resident Evil game after all. We've got to leave the mansion for a bit to go on a scavenger hunt so we can come back later with a MacGuffin that will open up some secret final area. Immediately after leaving the castle, we're jumped by Londoners, I mean Blades, these disgusting reptilian creatures that are ready to shank you at a moment's notice. And I think these guys might be my favourite enemy type in the game. They're much more aggressive than the marionettes and will rush you down with all sorts of different attacks and lunges compared to them. They even have projectiles and the ability to dig underground and burst out from underneath you. Their armour, however, is a bit of a double-edged sword for them, as while it does give them super armour and the ability to resist bullets, it's also possible to break it away, ridding them from that advantage as well as taking away their ability to parry, something that can't be done to the puppets. What they do retain, however, is their little air tech flip that allows them to break out of longer combos, so they're not completely defenseless when they lose their armor still. What I really like about these guys is that their faster but still fairly obvious wind-up times to their attacks have a much more natural flow of battle compared to the marionettes, whose weird, uncanny animations and timings can throw me off at times, despite the fact that said animations are designed to ease the player into things. And as such, I find the Blades to be both a slightly more complex but also just fun punching bag style DMC enemy to go up against. There's actually two variants of Blades, with a second bigger type that will show up later, but outside of their size and colour they're identical and both can still be hit with their special insta-kill critical hit move. Much like the puppets, you're able to knock them onto the ground if you hit them with something strong enough to do so, but with the Blades being these relatively chunky boys compared to the marionettes, they actually have two distinct states that are easy to tell apart. They can either be lying down on their back or on their bellies. And if you're able to hit them from behind, you're able to knock them onto their bellies, then it's only one well-placed helm splitter away from completely splitting them in two. And you'll get to watch their special death animation of them writhing around on the floor as they aggressively bleed out. It's a very useful trick like the rest of the insta-kills, but thanks to their armor and high agility, it's nowhere near as free as it is with the Sin Scissors. But interestingly, their back is the unarmored part of their body, and since this is already the side that you need to hit to knock them down the way you need to, it's actually a really great way of bypassing their defenses. Personally though, while this method is incredibly useful, I much prefer using what lies in wait for us in the next room, that being the second main weapon style that DMC1 has, Ifrit, the Flaming Gauntlets. And to get them, we need to do one of DMC's dreaded platforming sections, which honestly is really not all that bad. As long as you remember how horizontal movement works when jumping in this game, it really isn't tricky at all. Camera angles can be a little bit misleading, but you can't actually walk off of the edge of these things, so you can line yourself up really easily. Alternatively, if you've got double jump and at least one of Alistair's Devil Trigger moves, you can actually just fly right on up there. Now, Ifrit gives Dante a variety of slower punches and kicks that many of which can be charged up for really big damage. Obviously, doing so leaves you much more open, but as long as you're smart and methodical with when and where you use each move, you'll reap tons of rewards with it. What makes the charge strikes of the basic combo especially potent is its ability to blow through enemy parries and almost instantly break blade armor. The team really made sure that the first and second encounter with these enemies were immediately before and after getting the Ifrit gauntlets, just so you could see how much of a paradigm shift it creates. Each one of these charged up hits also have a just frame mechanic too. If you fully charge an attack, Dante will throw his punch without you needing to release the button, but if you do release the button at the exact moment the punch is fully charged, you'll deal even more damage. This makes the core combo have this bonus little extra feature to it that encourages you to stay focused and really learn the timing of the moves, but doesn't punish you too much if you don't bother to. It's very similar to something like Nero's Exceed mechanic in DMC 4 and 5, where it acts as this light mental tax that stays active constantly while you're playing, but is never particularly straining since it's not do or die if you don't pull it off every time. The only other attack Ifrit has by default is its dive kick, which is incredibly useful for closing distances but also staggering enemies. It does some decent damage, it moves quickly, and it feels oh so visceral. Just like Alistair, however, we do have a few special moves that can be bought from the Goddess of Time statues, with our first two being the input equivalents of Stinger and High Time being Kick 13 and Magma Drive. Despite using the same input, Kick 13 is kind of the opposite of a Stinger. Its range is pretty terrible, and it's more used as combo filler than a combo ender, as it's a single move that comes out very quickly, kind of like the Slapshot in Kingdom Hearts, but it also has a lot of impact, leaving it to be a very good counter move to interrupt enemy attacks, and usually giving you more than enough time to follow up afterwards. It's a very useful attack in Ifrit's moveset, but what makes it super cool is how it gets enhanced when used in Devil Trigger, replacing that simple quick strike with a whole flurry of different kicks that do a good chunk of damage and blow right through enemies' parries by overwhelming them. It does, however, eat away your Devil Trigger much faster whenever it's used, so you need to be mindful of spamming it in case you want to make the most out of DT's healing factor. Magma Drive, on the other hand, is an uppercut that will launch the enemy. It doesn't have a variant where Dante also rises into the air like High Time, but it can be charged to deal some very significant damage. You could also just immediately jump after doing the attack if you so desired. Then are its two Devil Trigger attacks. Inferno is a large AoE slam that dishes out some huge damage to every enemy around you, but also costs a sizable chunk of extra DT to perform, making it a very powerful move, but very inefficient unless there's at least 3 or more enemies within range. And then finally there's Meteor, a charged up projectile attack stolen directly from Nelo Angelo, which has a really long charge time compared to some of the other moves, but does some really good damage if you get it to full power. The last ability you can get for it is this weird passive effect when jumping called Rolling Blaze, which it gets instead of Air Hike. The ability gives you an active hitbox that surrounds Dante whenever he's jumping, dealing a slight amount of damage and causing a bit of stun to anybody who's near him. This seems pretty negligible at first, since the damage it deals is significantly less than just punching the enemy, and it seems like its only real function is adding a tiny bit of stun lock to one of your reposition options during combos. But its true purpose is that since this move is technically an attack, it means that it can parry enemies while still making use of the iframes of your jump. Trying to parry moves by manually swinging at them at just the right time can be risky, because if your timing is a little bit early or a little bit late, you're probably just going to get hit. With Rolling Blaze, if you use it late, you're still going to get hit, but if you use it early, now you're just dodging the attack. If you're using it as a parry, you now have a safety net of iframes that you can use to make things a bit easier for you. But if you don't want to use it that way, you can still just use it as a dodge that sometimes hits the enemy and creates a slightly bigger opening for you to capitalize on. It's definitely a more gimmicky attack compared to everything else in the game, but it still has its place. With Ifrit now in our possession, we have the last tool that makes up the game's core combat. There are still a couple more weapons coming up, but they're either variants of existing ones or used in extremely situational set-piece moments. The only other exception is a giant arm-mounted laser cannon called Nightmare Beta, which you can get in Mission 15 at the earliest. It's optional and isn't terribly useful, as it's a gun that requires DT to fire its bouncing shots that are ultimately not that useful compared to just the regular melee and healing that you'd get from using Devil Trigger normally. It can be charged and can do some pretty good damage in enclosed spaces, but is usually not your best option. The reason I want to bring it up a little bit early now is because it has one special accidental function that I want to be discussing alongside all of the other advanced techniques. I've already mentioned various things like the insta-kill critical hits, the ability to shoot both your shotgun and grenade launcher faster via shotgun twitching and grenade rolling, and the fact that Helm Splitter can deal more damage the higher up you are, but this is where we can get into the even more obscure stuff. First off, we have slash cancelling, a technique that involves having at least one frame of input interrupt your basic sword combo and resetting the sequence back to its first hit. It's most commonly used to repeat the first 2 hits of your basic sword combo back to back in quick succession. This can be extremely useful on many enemies as it allows you to stun lock them for a lot longer than would otherwise be possible. Alistair has multiple methods on how you can actually do this. Various stick wiggles can achieve it, but also aiming your gun at just the right time works as well. Each method has its pros and cons, but it's down to you to find which variation you really gel with. It's apparently also possible to do something similar with Ifrit using cancels along with Kick 13 and Magma Drive, but I've never been able to get the hang of it. The next trick, that's my personal favourite due to how cool it looks visually and how naturally it sets up for a high damaging helm splitter, is shotgun hiking. Shooting a launched enemy with a shotgun never actually applies any horizontal or downwards force to them. Even from the side or above, hitting them will only ever launch them higher. So if you combine this with enemy step and alternate between them, you're able to cancel your shots and fire much quicker, whilst also making Dante rise higher and higher alongside the enemy, letting you infinitely combo them into a safe area that other demons can't reach. And it also helps set you up to use that high up helm splitter, giving you a big combo ender to finish the enemies off. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's really appealing to me. On top of being really cool, it's one of the closest things this game has to air combat. And the other main example of pseudo air combat is vortex cancelling. Now, this trick actually has 2 variants based on whether or not you've purchased Vortex level 1 or level 2. The level 1 version is significantly easier to pull off, and is the one example where you might actually want to hold off getting the full moveset for the weapon. The core idea of this trick is that you repeatedly swap between using Vortex and a couple of shots from Ebony and Ivory to maintain a constant air juggle, as alone, one would let Dante drop to the ground while the other would do the same for the enemy. The reason why this is harder to do with level 2 Vortex is because in order to shoot your guns normally, you need to cancel out of flight mode, otherwise you're just setting yourself up to do an air raid instead. The level 1 Vortex has a set distance it travels and automatically takes you out of flight mode once it's finished. But the level 2 variant allows you to keep going as long as you hold the button down and keeps you in flight mode afterwards. Which means that to achieve the same result, you have to manually activate flight mode by turning Devil Trigger on and off. This is not only much harder to achieve, but also burns through your DT gauge much faster, which makes the level 2 version overall seem a lot worse for this purpose, but it is still something that you might want to get since it is better for its more intended use and has some nifty speedrun applications as well. Considering all of the crazy nonsense you can do in the air in the later games in the series, the fact that these are your 2 air combos in DMC1 can seem a little bit underwhelming. But considering that DMC1 is a significantly more grounded experience where the idea of juggling enemies was considered new, fresh and exciting, the fact that you're able to squeeze out even this much is really impressive. And it's just a matter of scope that you have to take into perspective. It's like comparing something like a 7-hit combo in Marvel vs. Capcom 3 compared to one in Super Turbo. One is significantly more impressive than the other. Another nifty trick that you can do is the quick weapon switch between Alistair and Ifrit by clicking in the right stick. Unfortunately, even though this method is much quicker than cracking open the menu, it's still not on DMC freeze level and is way too slow to be implemented into a combo. With one exception. Due to the designed prolonged hitbox of Alistair's round trip, you can sacrifice the time you'd usually spend shooting or kicking while it's active to switch to Ifrit instead, and you'll still have enough time to restart your combo and keep that star rank going before the round trip is ended. It's the one true weapon switch combo that this game has, unless you use a alternative, less official method that I've been using in some of my footage. But considering that's not part of the vanilla game, we'll talk about that a little bit later on. The last 2 unintentional mechanics are actually tied to one another, and that being the weird double hitbox that you get when equipping Ifrit and Nightmare Beta at the same time. Since Nightmare Beta is a big ass gauntlet that covers your whole arm, it stays on your character model even when using melee attacks, and this causes a weird after effect that makes all of Ifrit's left-handed punches hit twice, essentially doubling the damage. This is especially potent when used in tandem with Devil Trigger and a fully charged Just Frame Punch, because at that point you're stacking like 3 or 4 different types of damage boost. It doesn't end there, however, and we can actually take this a step further, making it so strong that it can defeat Phantom in a single strike, and that's by using a trick called Distortion. Distortion is actually a glitch predominantly found in DMC4, which exploits the fact that various attacks are considered different actions in your DT state compared to your normal human form, which allows you to activate or deactivate Devil Trigger on the moment of impact of your attack, causing it to hit twice, once in human form and once in Devil Trigger. It's a very popular trick to use alongside real impact, not only for its high damage, but because that attack has so many impact frames, it makes it really easy to pull off. In fact, the animation is so long you can distort the attack twice, letting you hit the enemy even more times, making the already powerful Boss Buster move even stronger, and helping you delete one particularly awful boss from existence all the quicker. Now, Distortion is a glitch that doesn't exist in DMC1, save for one particular example being the weird bonus hitbox you get on left-handed punches when having Nightmare Beta equipped, allowing you to nearly triple the damage that you get on the move on top of everything else you're already doing. The thing about this glitch is it's actually a fairly new discovery. It's something that's only cropped up in the last couple of years or so, and it just demonstrates how even after all of these years, when the simplest of the character action games has long since been quote-unquote solved, there's still brand new tricks and exploits that we can find and expand upon. Now, I know there's a subset of people out there who would argue and be annoyed at the idea that people can't just play a game normally, but this genre was partially built upon and inspired by a weird glitch opening up new gameplay opportunities in the first place. Every single one of these things helps expand the game out more and more, and can even become inspiration for new mechanics in later games in the series, and it's a key reason why I love this subgenre so much. It creates this ludo-narrative harmony that makes you want to play the same way Dante would actually fight, playing with your food and really savouring the suffering that you're causing the demons, and focusing on being cool and stylish more than just fighting. And while I never expect to reach full mastery of these games, the fact that I can get pretty close in DMC1 makes me have a particular soft spot for it. Upon leaving this area, we encounter Griffon, the next major boss of this game, and we get to experience the closest thing to Dante swearing.
Block off, Featherface, or you can stick around and find out the hard way.
Being a big-ass bird, Griffon spends most of his time in the air spamming various lightning attacks down at you, and suddenly I know how it feels. And because of this, it's a boss that you're going to rely on your guns a lot to be able to take down. Unlike DMC2's Infested Chopper, however, there's actually a bit more to it than just mashing square as fast as possible and pressing a dodge button periodically. For starters, Griffon's lightning attacks are just a lot more interesting to avoid. There's these Vs that close in on you but won't track your position on the Y-axis, so jumping and shooting like Mega Man allows you to keep attacking and keep up the pressure a lot more than if you just use the dodge roll, which is normally the better evasion option in most scenarios. Alternatively, his lightning curtain move is one that if you're far away enough when he uses, you're able to dodge without using either of your iframe options, as there's enough of a gap between each column that allows you to just strafe side to side to manually evade the lightning, so you can keep filling that not so paltry full of holes. His other attacks like his bombing run and his big slam on the other hand are much more standard attacks that you can dodge fairly normally, and the latter even opens him up for a few melee combos as well. And during these moments, jumping on his back is also an option where you can start wailing away on the nape of his neck if he tries to take off again. There's also these pillars of electrical discs that you can jump onto, which I believe are supposed to be there to give you an option to get onto Griffon while he's in mid-flight, but if you don't have air hike, they're a tad limited with how much they can help you. They all spawn in seemingly random locations, and with it being such a large arena and him moving around so much, it can be a little bit fiddly trying to get to the top of one while he's actually near it. Occasionally, you'll stagger him enough to knock him down where his core will be exposed and you can really lay in the damage. Unfortunately, the HD collection is not a very good port and is filled with all sorts of mostly graphical bugs and such, but one of the non-visual problems is that in this version, Griffon is too shy to present to you. He can still be stunned and you can still deal damage to him, but his collision box of his ribcage will push you away just enough to make various attacks more likely to whiff. Ultimately, however, this boss is one that you will be shooting a lot, but luckily all 3 guns do have their own particular use cases in this fight. The pistols are obvious with their ability to deal damage no matter where the 2 of you are on the screen, but it is relatively low damage unless you are using Devil Trigger. It's also important to keep in mind that the upper limit on how fast these can be shot is actually pretty high, so I do hope you have a turbo controller that you can actually use. The grenade gun, on the other hand, still serves a similar purpose to what it does normally. You still have to be careful with when and how you're firing it, and you do have a pretty strong tendency to miss thanks to having such a mobile foe. But when you do hit, you do deal some pretty decent damage and fill up your DT meter very quickly. Because of this, the usual method that I used to fight this boss with was to use the grenade gun to fill up DT and then switch out to Ebony and Ivory to cash it out. But these days, to reduce how often I go in and out of the menus, I've actually found a use for the shotgun in this fight too. Although it's a significantly more useful tactic on New Game Plus, as having Rolling Blaze and or Air Hike makes it much stronger and easier to perform. Essentially, all you're doing is using the exact same logic as shotgun hiking, but instead of using it on a launched enemy, you're using it on Big Bird over here. Using enemy step over and over allows you to fire the shotgun much quicker and at point blank range, since you need to be close to be able to use enemy step in the first place. What makes this tactic really useful is that Griffon has a number of ways to shake you off of his back when you're up in the air. But the thing is if you're up there because of enemy step, you're not on his back, and so you can't get flung off. Sure, he can still hit you with regular attacks, but you're moving constantly and getting iframes over and over from doing each enemy step. So even if you just spam it with Reckless Abandoned, you'll very likely dodge a bunch of the boss's counterattacks by accident. Having Air Hike makes it easier just to get up to Griffon in the first place, but also gives you a bit of a safety net in case you do miss an enemy step. And by having Rolling Blaze equipped, we're able to add another form of damage to this as well, increasing our DPS but also the speed in which we build DT. Unfortunately, Air Hike is pretty expensive, so on a normal playthrough it is possible that you won't have it at this point in the game. There's also not a shop between getting Ifrit and fighting Griffon 1, so you straight up don't have a chance to buy Rolling Blaze whatsoever. The funny thing about this boss is that it's actually completely optional. Defeating Griffon only really nets you style points and robes, it doesn't unlock any doors or anything. To move on, you just need to use Ifrit to light this second brazier, and boom, the door opens, and you can piss off and leave Griffon very confused as you scuttle away. Hell, on a second playthrough, since you already have Ifrit, you can actually open this door without going into the room the weapon is usually kept in at all, letting you beat this mission without even encountering Griffon whatsoever. Surprisingly, despite fighting a huge boss, the mission doesn't actually end here, and there's actually a few more rooms that we need to walk through, and even a new enemy type that we need to throw down with, being the fetishes. That's right, Dante must fight off his dark, intrusive thoughts and repress his cardinal desires in order to safely descend further into the depths of hell. But in actuality, the fetishes are just the upgraded version of the punching bag marionette enemies that we've been dealing with since the start of the game. They're the same basic type of enemy, but they have a good deal more health, will parry more aggressively, and have traded their daggers and potential shotguns for flaming chakrams. They can throw them like a boomerang for a long-range projectile, and they can breathe fire, which they'll almost always do after a parry. They retain the ability to scream and stun Dante as he's strung up on invisible strings, and will do it more often, requiring you to use DT or get very lucky to escape without getting hit. And to top it all off, they have this very annoying to avoid spin attack where they Beyblade over to you at an increasingly worrying speed. They're a lot more formidable than the puppets, but they are basically still that combo fodder punching bag enemy type, and as long as you can get behind them and launch them, you'll be able to dispatch them with ease. It's also these enemies who, even on normal, have enough health to survive a good number of shotgun hikes, making them the perfect enemy type to try this as well as the round trip weapon switch combo on. Mission 10 is another mission that doesn't have anything too new in it. If you did miss the secret mission before that introduces the Cyclops enemies, then you do encounter 2 of them at the end of this one, but they're completely ignorable since you can just run past them, so they continue to not leave that much of an impression. Mission 10 does, however, have a pretty fun gimmick throughout it, which is the mission's titular Canyon of the Mist. This is a Lost Woods style set piece area where you have to run through a sequence of identical rooms that end in a split path. Taking the wrong route will lead you back to the beginning of the area, so you'll need to follow this little orb of light to be able to show you the way. Sounds easy enough, but the orb will be absorbed into any enemy demon that it gets close to, and you'll need to kill them in order to release it. Speedrunners will actually push the enemy that the orb is currently inhabiting towards one of the pathways, so once you do defeat them, the orb will instantly move into the next area without having to worry about other demons gobbling it up. It's a simple enough gimmick, but it does make for an interesting change of pace to the gameplay formula. I've also got to give them huge respect for making a mission that pretty much takes place within a single room. It's just some really smart and efficient asset reuse. Once you leave the valley, you'll reach this giant fancy greenhouse, grab a few goodies from outside and enter it to complete the mission. Mission 11 starts with us needing to deal with a Death Scythe, a upgraded version of the Sin Scythes. Unlike the Death Scissors, we're not trapped inside a little container to fight them. Not unlike the Death Scissors, however, is that 3 DT double jump helm splitters will still absolutely wreck them. They even help you out by summoning these sigils on the floor that will launch you up into the air whenever you stand on them. I think they're supposed to make you more vulnerable for Death Scythe to swoop in and slash at you, but if you have Air Hike equipped, it ends up just setting you up to counter the swing instead. Once we've dealt with him, we can head out of the building for another secret mission, this one trying to teach us the joys of enemy step, asking us to reach the Blorb fragment by jumping off the heads of multiple Sin Scissors. Due to the sporadic nature of how the Sin Scissors fly about, it's not quite as elegant as some of the earlier examples of a secret tutorial, and in fact there's a later secret mission that does the exact same lesson on enemy step much better, but it existing here does give the game a second chance of introducing it to you nonetheless. To progress, we can head back into the greenhouse and jump down a well into this little underground section that is swarming with blades. You don't actually have to kill any of them, and with the sheer number of lizards hopping about, it might be very tempting to use your newfound enemy step knowledge to crowd surf along the top of them to safety. But by making sure we kill every last one of them, we'll be rewarded with yet another blue orb fragment. This is actually the room where Ifrit's move Inferno is exceptionally useful, and with this many enemies on screen, it pretty much gives you an instant S rank as well. And all of the enemy blades will respawn here whenever you re-enter the area, making it an excellent farming spot for red orbs. Heading back up out of the underground section allows us to jump onto the other side of this enclosed area that we could see from the main courtyard of the greenhouse, which is incredibly handy since Dante couldn't possibly shoot or cut through glass. Here we find the Sign of Chastity, which is obviously a big wrinkly brain, because remember kids, nothing is smarter than avoiding premarital sex like the plague. From here we can go back the way we came and head through to the back of the greenhouse into the garden, where we can place it and begin our first rematch with Nelo Angelo. While you may have gained some new punches and kicks to your arsenal, our favourite Kurono Tenchi has as well, and unlike us, he can actually combo them with his sword strikes. And he even steals stuff like your magma drive. This time around he's also a lot more resistant to both damage but also chi strats. If you were to time it right, you could actually slash cancel about 18 slashes in a row against Nelo 1, but Nelo 2 halves that down to roughly about 9 hits instead, making me feel like slash cancelling is actually more of an intended mechanic than you'd think based on how it's performed. Now, this version of Nelo is undoubtedly stronger, and is given the advantage of being in a very elaborate arena that can trip you and your camera up when you're trying to focus. But you've also received a ton of new tools since your first encounter, and there's also 2 large Grorbs in the arena to heal yourself mid-fight. They do however vanish after you use them, even if you use a yellow orb to respawn at a checkpoint. Luckily, the mission isn't that long, so you can always reload your save and start from scratch. The fight with Nelo Angelo 2 is undoubtedly harder, but you've got a lot more moves to use and a lot more health to burn through, so the increased difficulty actually ends up balancing out quite a bit. Since they're the newest weapons that you've received since the last fight with Nelo Angelo, I like to use Ifrit and the grenade launcher for this fight. The grenade gun I use exclusively just for its DT building potential, whilst Ifrit is insanely useful as soon as Nelo starts blocking your combos, since you can throw a fully charged punch or kick at him while he's blocking and it will put him into a long stun animation, letting you throw out a second fully charged attack immediately afterwards. He'll then try and counter you on your third attack, but by releasing it early, you're able to parry him and essentially trap him in a loop of your basic combo. You can also use DT's super armor as a sort of safety net in case he throws out one of his quicker counter moves that might throw your timing off. It's also exceptionally useful to just throw out DT enhanced kick 13s, as they constantly blow through any ability to parry that he might have and just keeps him locked down while you really mess him up. Thanks to the DT cost, it's not the most efficient way to deal with him, but it is the safest. It's quite commonly seen that the repeat boss fights of DMC1 are just a cheap way of padding out the game, and they probably are to a degree. I'll be the first to admit that it's maybe overdone just a little bit too much. But I do feel like having to fight each of the game's bosses 3 times does have an interesting effect on how you perceive them throughout the game. The free fight structure is an excellent vehicle for telling a story through game mechanics, and it's something that DMC1 did, but 3 really perfected with its Virgil boss fights. His fights cap off the end of each act of the story, whilst also being used to show us how far our hero has come throughout the journey. In our first bout, we lose tremendously to a Virgil who doesn't even need to try, whilst in the second, we're now much stronger and able to go toe to toe with him, but ultimately a winner is not decided as the fight is cut short. It's only until the final showdown where we face a Virgil who's not only trying, but is desperate to win and is really pulling out all the stops to do so. This is something that the repeat boss fights in DMC1 really lack for the most part, but we do see and feel it with good old Nelly over here. Well, kind of. He does just kind of run away from the second fight rather than it ending in a draw, but round 1 was definitely a loss for Dante until our necklace came and saved us. And we do see a stronger version of Nelo Angelo for round 3, so it does kind of balance out. Instead of it being about Dante growing and rising to the occasion, it's more just a best 2 out of 3 situation. What these repeat fights do, however, even in DMC1, is affect the player's psychology and how they remember each one of these bosses, and the response that the player will have after beating a boss is a sliding scale between these 2 outcomes. One being that you blitz your way through the encounter and maybe only manage to win by the skin of your teeth, with the other being that you really struggle with the boss and have to throw yourself at it 10, 15, 20 times before you eventually get the patterns down and win it by knowledge. And these 2 outcomes will very likely affect how you end up seeing rounds 2 and 3. The former outcome will more than likely make the repeat boss fight seem much harder, as you never really learned how to deal with the problems, and there's now more to worry about and longer to worry about it for thanks to the bigger health bar. Your early success leaves you very ill prepared to take on future challenges. The latter outcome, however, will cause the player to approach round 2 with dread, since they're expecting it to be a good deal harder, but then they realise that, oh wait, I already solved this when I had a much smaller pool of health, and I've got a ton of new options now. Damn, this is easy. Obviously this doesn't apply to every player, you might sit somewhere in between these 2 options or somewhere else entirely on the scale. But I think for the majority of players, this is the case. And depending on how you play, your perspective on the game will either be, oh wow, this game's really ramping up in difficulty, but I am beating the bosses still, so I'm clearly really good at the game. Or, oh wow, this second boss fight is really easy, I'm so much better than I was before. Either way, it results in the player feeling really good about their achievements so far, whilst also forcing them to lock in and learn the mechanics in some shape or form at some point. This is something I'd like to say about the first rematch with Griffon in Mission 12, but that fight has a whole host of problems. But first we've got something far more intimidating than some mildly janky boss fights, and that's some majorly janky swimming mechanics. So Mission 12 is called Ghost Ship, and after walking down a short corridor behind this secret passage in the greenhouse, it becomes very clear as to why. We need to get inside the ship in order to keep progressing, and luckily there's a massive hole in the hull so we can just swim right on through. But once you jump in the water, you're probably going to be thinking, wait, why is this all first person? It wasn't like this before. Why are my controls inverted? This sucks. How do I move forward? Why is the bottom of the screen in a constant state of screen tearing? The answer to the last one is because the HD collection is a functional but ultimately pretty awful port, but yes, we have a bizarre setup for swimming that is made even more bizarre when you take into account that we've already been underwater in this game and it didn't have these controls. I've seen some arguments say that this is a magical air pocket, but that doesn't really explain why Dante still takes damage when he's here. Luckily, as bad as the water controls are, their awfulness is actually very overstated, as these sections are pretty far and few between and literally all last about 2 to 3 minutes. Even less so if you know where to go and what to do. But yeah, if you want to swim about, you need to aim where you want to go with the control stick and then repeatedly mash the X button to swim in that direction. And if you hold down your lock on, you're able to slowly swim side to side, which is useful for some minor evasive maneuvers during combat. That's right, there's underwater combat too. Once we get onto the ship, we find ourselves a needle gun, a triple burst rifle that can only be fired underwater. And with it, you'll be able to kill the grand total of all 5 underwater enemies that are actually in the game, with each blade that you fight going down in 3, maybe 4 volleys of shots. You can actually run past this bad boy if you're not careful, and if you do, you'll have to grab it in the next mission while underwater, while enemies are trying to kill you. So it's best that you nab it now in mission 12 to save yourself the headache. Heading out to the top and getting on deck, we can now light this fire to get the ghost ship moving once again, but not before we climb to the top of the masses and stinger off of it to the bow of the ship for a cheeky little blob fragment. Lighting the torch summons another Death Scythe who, just like the last mission, is really easy to put down if you know the double jump helm splitter trick. This gets the boat moving again, and we now have to engage in the world's first boss fight where we're fighting the stage more than the boss itself. It's time for Griffon round 2, and this time we're fighting in the opposite of a wide flat square of land. And it gets really bloody tricky to shoot down a bird who keeps using angles to fly behind the ship and cut off your line of fire. Luckily, by climbing the masses, you can get a much better angle, but there's plenty to interrupt you as well. Hologram Wing is the new key move added to this version of the fight, and it's annoying as hell to deal with, even if it can be useful too. It's a big glowing red bird made of lightning that zooms around and latches itself onto you. Whenever it makes contact, it will send you flying up into the air, which actually makes getting on top of the masses much easier. And if it makes contact a second time within quick succession, it does a good chunk of damage. But the worst part about it is that it draws your line of fire with the game's lock-on systems, making it a pain in the ass to actually shoot Griffon whenever it's out. It can be destroyed pretty easily, but sadly Griffon can just periodically spawn another in whenever it wants. The easiest and fastest way to clear this fight, at least on normal, is just to get a good angle and to spam air raid like crazy. You can faff about trying to lure Griffon down into the small section of the boat that he can actually stand in, but attacking him here is very dangerous, as the enclosed little box that you have to fight him in makes it very hard to get away from his various AoE attacks. And trust me, you do not want to be near him when he pulls them off. Anyway, once we've suffered through and survived Griffon's little hidden run, we're able to access the captain's quarters and move on to mission 13, which I'm bundling in with mission 12 since it's the shortest in the game and there's really not much to say about it. You swim through 3 or 4 rooms, take out 3 or 4 enemies, and the mission is completed. It's a super easy mission to S rank and is basically just a free deposit of red orbs. There is, however, a secret mission in this level that actually takes place in an entirely unique room that gives me motion sickness since it has no depth perception. The secret mission, however, simply involves more swimming and shooting. The whole swimming mechanic is one that feels super out of place in the game. I get the distinct impression that somebody on the dev team developed a new way of navigating in 3D space at some point, and instead of building an entire game around the concept, they decided to use it as a simple set piece instead. As I said before though, as terrible as it is on the surface, it's really not all that bad in the long run, as it is over pretty quickly, and I suppose it does make for a good way of separating the action sequences. Honestly, we've talked about some of the aesthetic details in some of the early missions, but as far as actual level design goes, I think DMC 1 has some of the more weird mission objectives in the series. But I do feel like this is a bit of a double-edged sword, being as much of a good thing as it is a bad thing. If you wanted me to recount to you the pathway through one of the Clyfod route levels in DMC 5, I wouldn't be able to tell you what to do first, but I think I could probably walk somebody through the entirety of DMC 1 purely off of memory. As much as the swimming sections suck, they do leave a distinct impression within the memory, meaning that you'll be able to recount much more of your journey with DMC 1, instead of, you know, just all of the memes. Now, granted, a lot of these are incredibly simple most of the time, usually revolving around grabbing a MacGuffin and just putting it somewhere else, but it does always mean that there's at least something new between each of the game's combat arenas. The locales that you traverse are actually pretty varied, especially thanks to this little tangent outside of the castle we go on. And there's always something like the next mission's spinning spike floor or the Canyon of Mist that help make missions stand out in the mind just that little bit more. The swimming and platforming sections may not be super well received, but at least they do leave an impression, if nothing else. And I think it's just another reason as to why this game and series in general has been able to stand the test of time with only 6 games over 25 years. And another reason why I think I like DMC 1's levels as much as I do is the amount of exploration there is for optional stuff. Not all of the Blorb fragments are acquired through shops and secret missions, as many of them are just hidden for the overly curious to find. And there's a ton of free shop items and hidden red orb spots for you to find hidden all over the levels that are just there for you to pick up. The greenhouse, for example, had a bunch of hidden goodies in various hard to reach areas that you're supposed to use this floating platform to discover. And there's other examples like these tombstones, which at first seem like they're just made for set dressing, but can actually be pushed back like a classic 2D Zelda game to reveal goodies. And Mission 14 has this really fun sequence that you can go through where every single secret that you discover actually leads you to another one. The mission starts off with this booby-trapped spinning hallway that you need to activate in order to escape to the surface. And it's another one of those interesting level ideas that I was just talking about that break up the pace a bit. But it's after getting out of this room where the fun breadcrumbing begins. Once you get off of the elevator and try to continue, you'll notice a blue orb fragment sitting on top of an area that you just can't get to. Even with air hike, the platform that it's on is just a bit too high for you to actually reach. And so you'll probably start jumping around looking for a way up, and in the process noticing a giant orb sitting on top of the elevator cover. And this is an area that you actually can get to. It might be a little tricky, especially if you don't have air hike yet, since you do need the full extent of Dante's double jump as well as good positioning so you activate his little clamber animation, but it is possible. Now from here you'd be able to use air raid or a stinger jump to get that blue orb fragment, but you'll also notice that there's a big red orb on the cliffside behind you, making you want to get that too. But this red orb is actually on the first of some very obvious stair stepping that takes you up even higher, and getting to the top of it gives you a yellow orb that you wouldn't have been able to see. And from here you're even higher up, so you can still use the stinger to launch yourself across the area and land right next to that blue orb. A fun little bonus is that there's a holy water not behind but directly underneath the waterfall that you're very likely to notice if you mess up the jump from earlier to get to the cliff edge. So even if you failed the execution, the game will still reward you for trying to explore. This is a single room in the game and one with no enemies in it whatsoever, but it is a really nice looking one, so the devs decided to stuff it full of secrets to really get the most out of it. And it's a perfect sequence where each reward leads you to the next until you get to the last one, which is very likely what you were going after in the first place. Later DMC games do still have hidden secrets and rewards like these, but not in the same concentration, and I feel like over time they mostly just became hidden red orb spots. Since Yorbs got replaced with the much more overpowered Glorbs, and stuff like items got more and more de-emphasized until being phased out completely. Also, many of the blue orb fragments in DMC 3 and 4 got assigned to combat adjudicators, which I really do like, but I also kinda miss exploring for them. And while I tend to avoid using items, I'm not above using holy waters on the Saviour in DMC 4 or Devil Stars to skip the upcoming Afterburner section in this game. Those are parts of the game that I just don't find fun, and being able to skip them definitely is a blessing, but I feel like only using items that you got from exploration is a lot more satisfying from ones that you just bought in the shop. And it also means that you've just got more money to actually spend on moves, which is far more important. Now, Mission 15 is special because it's both our third showdown with Griffon, but also the point in the game where cutscenes and actual dialogue start showing up again. Before we get to the boss fight itself, however, we have to make our way through these shielded paths. Well, actually, you only have to go through one of them, but you might as well do both since they yield quite a few orbs of every variety, as well as a fair few support items. And the optional one also allows you to get the Nightmare Beta Gun at the earliest possible opportunity. Both paths are nearly identical, with the first thing you see being a dark stairway going underground. Luckily, just in front of you is a big glowing pile of rubble that you can examine to get a key item called Luminite, which is an ordinary type of rock from hell that gives off a natural glow when it's brought into the human world. Despite being a key item, this doesn't actually need to be used to unlock any doors, not directly at least, but it does act as a torch to allow you to see better in this dreary hallway, as well as many more to come in later missions. After this corridor, we get two rotating obstacle courses, not unlike the previous one that we saw in the last mission. The two of them will either lead to our shiny new gun, or twin lances that are used to access the Colosseum just outside. And this is where we'll fight Griffon for the final time. Griffon is the oldest and most loyal of Mundus's lieutenants, and despite his massive size, his demeanour is actually quite eloquent and honourable. His first encounter has him announce his presence, and he makes it very clear as to why he's actually there. Your fights with him thematically feel more like your battles with Nelo Angelo than they do with Phantom, and this is most true for his fight in the Colosseum. This encounter plays out much like your first with Griffon, except his attacks are much more aggressive and come out much faster. He also gains access to much more of his moveset regardless of whether or not he's in the air or on the ground. And to top it off, he now has a bonus passive of this aura that deals light contact damage whenever you stand on his back. A useful tip for this boss fight is that if you use a fully charged Meteor level 2 and hit him from the front, you're actually very likely to hit him twice. This is because his hitbox is so large that your fireball will be able to linger inside of his hitbox for just long enough to let the attack register 2 separate times, making it a great way of racking up the damage right at the start of the fight. And on normal difficulty, this basically lets you skip the entirety of phase 1. However, you might not want to be too hasty because this phase change actually affects the arena quite a bit. Like your second fight with Nelo Angelo, there's 2 green healing orbs that you can get in this zone. The only catch is they're only accessible via these tiny little portals that teleport you up to a higher level. There's even some stuff like some blob fragments up here. Problem is, however, once you deal enough damage, you'll knock Griffon through the bridge that runs through the centre of the stage, tearing off his left wing in the process. And this removes access to the higher levels since Griffon is now grounded, meaning that you can easily screw yourself out of some extra health upgrades as well as some green orbs that are not available during the points of the fight that you'd actually need them. Phase 2 is a somewhat brutal one, as while he can't fly away anymore, it also means that there's not really any obvious openings where you can run in an attack at close range like there was before. Griffon also gets a substantial defense boost after losing one of his wings for some reason, making it a bit of a war of attrition. Luckily, since he is no longer flying, doing things like tracking his movements or landing hits with a grenade gun are now significantly easier to pull off. So if you know his patterns and stay pretty patient, he's still plenty easy to deal with. With the final blow dealt, Griffon will try and make his escape, but is ultimately skewered by a surprise bit of rubble. And it's here we get one of the more important cutscenes in the game. Griffon acknowledges Dante's strength, noting that he's even stronger than Sparda once was, even though we're still only in the first game, and he begs his master to give him one last burst of power to help finish us off. With this, Mundus makes his first appearance in a spectral form and goes all Saiyan Saga Vegeta on his subordinate's ass, killing him off as he's not worthy, much to Dante's chagrin. Trish then shows up to tell us how cool and sexy we are again, but it's here where we get to see a side of Dante that we don't often get to enjoy, a much more serious, stoic and angry version of him. For obvious reasons, DMC1 Dante is very different to the version that most people are more familiar with. After all, it is the only game in the series that Isano's team didn't work on. And the version that was created by Kamiya and Team Little Devils is quite a bit different. The thing is, most people tend to chalk this up to bad voice direction and or some hokey writing that was rushed out the door because at the time, nobody really cared about such things. But if we take a look behind the scenes at stuff like various bits of concept art from the art book, we're able to paint a pretty good picture of what this version of Dante is supposed to be. And the best part is that it's not even like he's incompatible with later incarnations, since the 2007 anime rendition of the character is basically a perfect middle ground between the two. And stuff like the Dante is depressed headcanon that gets passed around really helps make the games feel pretty cohesive. To really get the most complete understanding of Dante and DMC1, however, I think it's best that we take a look through something else that Kamiya personally oversaw, something that ties directly to the game and is the only other piece of media that represents this version of Dante. That's right, I bought and read the DMC1 tie-in novel, as well as the 2 DMC3 prequel mangas just for good measure. This book acts as a sort of original origin story for Dante before DMC3 even existed, and as such now causes several continuity errors and plot holes to rear their heads. Luckily, with just a few grains of salt and some mental gymnastics, they are for the most part pretty easily explained. The book covers a period of time where Dante was still going by the name Tony Redgrave, an alias that he used to try and hide from the demons. and is a nice little nod to that original RE4 prototype that the original game was supposed to be. And it's actually quite a fun and interesting read, since it's basically the second bit of DMC media that we ever got, and serves as a basis for a lot of Dante's personality going forward. So many staples of the series started within this novel, such as Dante's rotten luck with women and his love for strawberry sundaes, which funnily enough were a thing far before DMC3 really solidified his love for pizza. It also gives us hidden context to stuff like Dante's silly personality, and to what extent rejecting the demon within actually affects the likes of half-breeds like the two twins of Sparda. Something that really surprised me about the novel is that much of Dante's playfulness and bravado is actually a mixture of a psychological coping mechanism, but also a bluff to throw his enemies off. When I originally heard this about the book, I was a little bit disappointed, because honestly, it makes Dante seem kinda lame, and not in the usual funny way. It's a character trait that I usually quite like in characters like Spider-Man, for example, but for Dante it seemed a little weird. But after actually reading it, and considering that it is an early origin story, it does make quite a bit of sense that Dante is still evolving from that crying mama's boy that he's always been. After all, he is still genuinely his usual cocky self when dealing with humans, so it's not that hard to believe at some point later down the line, the mask starts to become the man. Why I bring this up is because in the final Griffon cutscene, just like the novel, we can see that underneath all of the quips and the devil may care attitude is actually someone who underneath it all is still very angry and passionate about the idea of getting revenge for what happened to his mother and brother. It's a side of Dante that I feel like we really don't get to see post Devil May Cry 3, but it really does go a long way as to explain why Dante is so reluctant to embrace his devil side. It's not because he doesn't want to give in to anger. Dante isn't a Jedi. It's because, despite all appearances, underneath it all, he's consumed by it. It's not just his brother and his mother that he's getting revenge for, it's for every single person he's cared about along the way who's paid the ultimate price for trying to help him. One other tidbit that I really like about this area that the novel covers is that while Dante is still living as Tony Redgrave, he's actually affected by the miasma of the demon world the same way any normal human would be. That's right, the idea that the demon realm is filled with Mundus's fart gas is not actually an Adi Shankar thing. But here in the novel, it works as a way to make easier prey out of humans whilst powering up the demons, so it makes a lot more logical sense. What I really like about this is that it's very obvious that the exception of his devil side is supposed to be the book alluding to the concept of devil trigger. But the thing is, it never actually describes Dante as physically transforming. This is really convenient because it actually ends up playing really well into both the game DMC3 and its prequel manga. And it ends up showing a pretty consistent and gradual change in Dante growing as a character, but also in power. In the DMC1 novel, Dante accepts that there's a devil within him, allowing him to push past his human limitations, but not yet giving him any sort of transformation. In the DMC3 manga, that devil is forced out of him by another demon, but in an incomplete way, giving him a small power boost while still being unstable, and it ultimately falls apart as Dante is still rejecting it. In the DMC3 video game, Dante stops repressing the devil within in order to stop his brother, but also needs to rely on his devil arms that he's equipped with in order to actually activate it, with each one of his weapons giving Dante a slightly different look as he draws out its latent power and combines it with his own. This pattern continues in DMC1, but with him taking the weapon's full devil form instead of just parts of it, until ultimately in DMC2 and 4, Dante is just able to use his own devil form without assistance. Even though a lot of this is probably unintentional, it's still a great way of seeing the growth through small, subtle differences to how he uses his powers from game to game. And it has the added bonus of showing us that as Dante progressively lets go of all of his anger, he not only gains more and more control over his devil trigger state, but also becomes that wacky uncle that we all know and love. With that all done and dusted, we can head through the spire that shish kebabbed Griffon and grab ourselves the Wheel of Destiny, a key that we can use to return back to the police station, the castle. But before we do that, we can immediately re-enter the Colosseum for another secret mission, and the last of those more secret tutorial ones that are in the game. Stairway of Tranquility is probably the easiest secret mission in the game because there's not really any sort of fail state. You can take all the time in the world finishing it because it requires no meter and the enemies don't attack you, at least physically.
Stop it! Stop laughing at me!
But essentially, this is just another enemy step tutorial. You have to do a lot more enemy steps in a row to actually get the Blorb fragment, but at least they're not trying to kill you. And just like before, it is much easier if you do have air hike. Either way, we're now back inside the castle, but there's something wrong about it now, at least more than previously. The whole building is now cloaked in shadow, and the more time that we spend here, the more inconsistencies we start finding. Various doors from one room to another have vanished, been moved around, and the music is shifted to this much more foreboding, otherworldly track. Personally, I love the dark castle theme from the beginning of the game. It's got this very dread-inducing banging constantly in the background, but it's ultimately still very slow and atmospheric in its core design. It gives the impression of the area being dangerous and deadly, but not at this exact specific moment. The new castle theme, upon returning to it, has this ever-building tension that's constantly playing. It feels like the music that plays to build tension right before the murderer jumps out in a slasher film or something. It makes it abundantly clear that even in your moments of safety, you're not. It has the stylings of something bordering on Silent Hill 1's soundscape. And honestly, all of the music in this game is excellent, even if many of them are not necessarily that iconic. Now, music has always been an area that I really tend to overlook in my videos, since realistically, it's not really my forte. Other than just going, I like song, it make brain make good chemical. I feel like a lot of the time, the only thing I can really say is going, holy shit, is that a leitmotif, whenever I recognize a melody. And so for music, I never really have much to say, but I think for DMC1, I can manage. We are, however, gonna get a little bit pretentious. Public Enemy and Lock and Load are the two standard battle themes, and these are the iconic ones on the soundtrack that will leave an impression on you over time, to the point where these are the ones that are fairly often reused throughout the series. You can see these songs being reused in places like that one jukebox in DMC3, Dante's battle theme in DMC4, or that one mission in DMC5. They're banger tracks that really get you ready to raise hell on your foes, and you'll get plenty acquainted with them whenever you're fighting. Beyond these, however, are plenty more great tracks as well. Stuff like the theme that plays when receiving Alistair are suitably epic and grand, but I also love how the cathedral music is exceptionally standout with how many organs it uses in an OST that already has tons of organs, making it leave an incredibly large impression. Boss themes also get the added benefit of being able to be remixed for their repeat encounters, meaning that tracks like Ultraviolet can be followed up with the much grander in scale Super Ultraviolet to really make them impactful. The more ambient tracks, on the other hand, while not as memorable, especially with how little of them you actually end up hearing, still do an absolutely phenomenal job at achieving what they're trying to convey. There's the two ambient castle tracks I've mentioned already, but there's others like the one that you'll hear when first entering the mirror dimension. Evil Vacuum, as it's called, seems like a pretty standard grungy song at first, but when listening to it with intent, you'll notice there's actually so much more to it than you might have realised. There's an eclectic mix of various different samples being used here, and they all seem to be coming from very unsettling places. There is some very obvious religious motifs that we've seen throughout the rest of the game, like organs being played or the low chanting of a choir, but there's also instruments that sound like the slithering of a snake or whispers from some unidentifiable creature, and there's even sections that feel very alien in nature. The foreboding and menacing identity of the two castle themes is still here, but there's a much bigger focus on the song feeling unnatural, off-putting, and just overall wrong. It's like if body horror existed in musical form. And I do have to wonder if this is another area where its survival horror roots played a part in it all. One track where I don't have to wonder about it, however, is the shop theme. The image of the goddess of space and time is just as unnatural sounding as many other songs in the game's soundtrack, but it has this ethereal, soothing feeling to it as well. And just from listening to it, I can feel it in my soul that it was a concept for a save room theme at some point or another. What I particularly like about this track, however, is while the game has a pretty predominant focus on its gothic theming and a very Gnostic interpretation of its demonic presences, the goddess of space and time is instead very, Persian or Egyptian inspired in contrast to that. Considering this is where Dante goes to get stronger, it's almost like he's making some sort of a deal with a foreign power to aid him while trekking through a hell that he's much more familiar with. The big problem I have with the music is that you don't ever really get to hear much of it. You can move through areas so quickly that it changes and resets whatever track is playing, and if enemies show up, which will happen a lot in an action game, you'll be switching to a battle theme more often than not. I think one of the main reasons why I've never appreciated this stuff until now is that songs like the Mirror Dimension theme is stuff that you'll only ever really hear for about 15 or 20 seconds during any given playthrough. This song on the soundtrack is really good, but you only ever hear it in 2 rooms that you never come back to, and to top it all off, it ends up getting interrupted by a battle theme. From here we'll need to start exploring the now changed castle, but within this first room we'll actually encounter a brand new and pretty interesting enemy type, the Plasma, who in another cool enemy intro cinematic blasts out of the horse statue that we Jonathan Joestarred Phantom on earlier. These electrical bats are actually a lot more involved than you'd assume based off of just their appearance, which does make sense as it's pretty late into the game to start introducing basic flying enemies. And so they actually have the ability to shapeshift into Dante and fight him with a bunch of his own moves on top of the laser beam attacks that they can already throw at you. This is actually a pretty cool idea that they could use as a sort of mini-boss style of enemy type that they could throw at you during the final wave of any forced encounter, but the Plasmas aren't really that. See, the first one won't, but all future encounters with the Plasmas will have them come at you in groups, and they're honestly quite squishy and can be dealt with pretty easily in any number of ways. The problem is that whenever you hit one, there's a chance of it splitting into 2, with the new clone having full health, which can result in you needing to fight anywhere between 4 and 14 of them in any given encounter. The splitting is seemingly random, but I've always found that they're more likely to do it whenever you're attacking them with Alistair, which they're resistant to, so it's best to rock up to all of your fights with them using Ifrit. With those all now settled, we can make our way through the castle back to the cathedral, where we'll find that there's now a huge mirror-like puddle in the centre of the room, as well as multiple devices attached to the walls. This is our portal to the demon world, but right now it's not corporeal enough for Dante to use yet, so we need to find a way to get through it. Before that, however, this room is going to be the stage to our next and newest boss fight against Nightmare, who really lives up to the name. Or at least, it can. Nightmare is a nondescript blob of demonic goo, and is actually a precursor to the gun that we found earlier. It's a being who has no logical sense to its form, with its design being built for the sole purpose of killing anything and everything it comes across, whilst also being unkillable itself. So much so, in fact, that Mundus couldn't actually kill it after realising that he wasn't able to properly control it, and so he just sealed Nightmare away in the realm between Hell and the human world as a last line of defense guard dog. And with lasers, skewers, and various other hurty objects spewing out of every single unidentifiable orifice of this thing, it makes it almost impossible to get in and deal any damage without getting hit yourself, making each one of the fights with it feel like a war of attrition. Nightmare is also a menace due to the fact that it can sap away at your DT meter, which is not only something that you want for that extra damage and healing, but it's also incredibly useful in this fight to have the light super armor that it provides, because it makes a night and day difference when you're being swamped with ice slugs and lasers that would otherwise knock you out of your attack animations. You can't even damage it until you activate the switches at the side of the arena to light up the room and force Nightmare to present its cores whilst attacking, as these are the only weak points that give you an opportunity to actually deal any damage. There is, however, one alternative way. Whenever the lights are out, Nightmare will have access to a move where a mouth will come out from the ground and swallow Dante whole. And in a weird sort of way, this is actually an attack we want to get hit by, since the move is actually a really easy way of getting some healing in as well as a full DT charge, but only provided you've learnt how to deal with the game's previous bosses. When Nightmare eats you, it will send you to some pocket dimension version of Hell and force you to fight memories of the game's previous bosses, placing you against shadow versions of Phantom 3, Griffon 3, and Nelo Angelo 1 respectively. Luckily, however, each copy has a significantly reduced health bar, so defeating them is actually very quick and easy, especially on normal, where it really feels more like a cool set piece gimmick more than anything. The reason why you'd want to get hit by this move and deal with the second boss is because before you fight them, you have to fight a good number of the skull enemies, and between them and a very easy to kill sub-boss, you're very likely going to end up finishing with at least one of them dropping a green orb or two, something that's even more likely when you're at low health, so you can can kind of plan around this. Or at the very least, you can deal with the enemies fairly easily and just use your DT meter to heal you instead. And you don't have to worry about wasting your DT meter on this sub-boss because after defeating them, you'll get a full refill. Well, unless you leave it on during their dying animation. But this means you can jump back into your fight with Nightmare fully refreshed and recharged. But fighting a few more enemies just for the chance of a few more green orbs is quite a bit of a gamble. But luckily there is another good reason as to why you'd want to do this, and this is because the damage that you deal to the sub-boss is actually transferred over to Nightmare after you break free from its grasp. So taking on a few extra enemies is a blessing in disguise in comparison. Doing this, however, not only makes your current round with Nightmare significantly easier, but also helps you out with the later fights too. So Nightmare has a bit of a reputation for being really bloody hard, and this is for a good number of reasons. The camera is not always the best in these arenas, a lot of the damage that you take is straight up unavoidable or requires the patience of a saint to get around, and stuff like your soft lock-on prioritizes enemies over switches, so if Nightmare's close enough, it means that the feature that is designed to help you is actually actively fighting you and making your life more difficult when you're trying to turn the lights back on. These are all pretty well known issues, but there's actually a secret reason as to why Nightmare feels so damn hard, especially during his third fight, and especially on Dante Must Die, and it's all due to a hidden mechanic that is built into its weak spots. As I've mentioned, Nightmare has two separate demon cores that you have to hit in order to damage him whenever the lights are on. As you do hit them, however, you'll notice that these crystals go from blue and whole, to green and half broken, to red and completely broken. When seeing this, your first thought would probably be, oh well, that's just a in-universe visual indicator to show how much damage it's taken. And that is partially true, but it doesn't actually break based on how much damage Nightmare has received, it breaks on how many hits it's taken instead. So many of Alistair's moves such as Million Stabs, Air Raid and Round Trip will break it much quicker, whilst Ifrit will break it much slower, even to the point where using Meteor level 2 enough will let you beat round 1 without breaking any of them. So why does any of this matter? Well, you see, the status of each of the cores actually persists through each one of the fights, and in a weird sense of backwards logic, the more damage the core, the less damage you deal, to the point where the red core will only be taking 20% damage from all your attacks. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you that in a boss which is basically a race to see who can drain the other's health bar first, it's a bit of a shit situation to be in for Nightmare 3. But what this means is that how you fight Nightmare in the earlier rounds will directly help or hinder you in the later ones. Now, Meteor is the best move to use if you want to be as efficient as possible since it's all big single hits, but if you don't have it yet or just don't like using it all that much, then what I like to do is equipping Nightmare Beta and just using the default charge combo. But something else you can do is switch to the grenade launcher and shoot the boss while it's still invincible, as this is a great way of building up DT meter in between attacking the cores. After defeating Nightmare, it will retract and run away, and we're now free to look for two different items that will let us traverse through the portal ourselves. And we can start our search by crossing the broken bridge and presenting the Staff of Hermes, which will conjure up two different paintings of different locations within the castle. The right one will take you to the bedroom where we first met Nelo Angelo, but for now there's not an awful lot here other than a blue orb fragment and an untouchable. This is, however, where the game will just give you Nightmare Beta if you haven't picked it up previously. And if we take the left one, it will end the mission as it takes us to the early game stairway where we first encountered the marionettes, which coincidentally is an area that has otherwise been blocked off since we've returned to the castle. Mission 17 is probably my favourite in the entire game for the simple fact that this is when we finally get our third and final round with Nelo Angelo. But before that, we also get an introduction to one of the coolest enemy types in the entire series almost immediately after starting the mission. After heading up all the way to the top of the stairway to this tiny study that was previously blocked off, we find another painting to a brand new location that we've never been before. Here we find ourselves in an empty courtyard with a brilliant shot of the moon as we're attacked by two frosts. These are upgraded versions of the blades, much like the fetishes are to the marionettes, and they actually start attacking us before the cutscene even ends, which in hindsight is something this game really likes to do. It does feel a little bit unfair and bullshit whenever it happens, but I do like how it keeps you on your toes, and I appreciate the idea that it's trying to blend gameplay and cutscenes together. Now, the blades already had a really great design, so this special upgraded form of them is just the icing on the cake for me. Compared to the regular blades, they have a pretty different moveset, especially if you fight them the way I do, which is up close and personal, stun locking them with Ifrit combos. Overall, they are a little bit heavier than regular blades, making them a good deal harder to launch and juggle, and while they might not necessarily be as objectively fun to fight within the game's combat system, they do make for a pretty cool enemy type to cap off any encounter, especially on hard mode where they start showing up much earlier. Now, while I'm more used to seeing their more unique attacks, they do have a couple of variants on existing Blades moves, such as the digging attack being replaced with a teleport, where the ice cloud that trails behind them will actually cause damage to you as they pass through, and in place of their projectile, they have a move that sends out a chain of chasing icicles that come out of the ground. The big standout feature and unique mechanic of the Frosts, however, is that when they're weak, they'll actually lose their arm and then try and seal themselves in a pillar of ice to heal it. If you're able to break them out before they finish the animation, they'll be both low on health but also stunned, perfectly setting you up for the kill. But if you don't, they'll heal back up to full health, which will obviously drag out the fight. From here, we head through into a new corridor with more of those high frame rate gift windows that I like so much, and have to fight our way through to get to a giant room which for some reason has a skeleton of a T-Rex in it. Yet another holdover from Resident Evil, no doubt. And the puzzle here is that we need to rotate this mirror to reflect the moon's light to create some invisible platforms, but before we do that, we have to deal with the T-Rex pelting fireballs at us. There is, however, a magic barrier that prevents us from getting too close to it, so we need to swing at just the right time in order to baseball parry the fireballs back and destroy the king of the dinosaurs. What I really like here is that the idea is planted in you that, oh, fireballs can be sent back. This by itself is not particularly helpful, in fact, it's straight up detrimental in the upcoming fight, but without explicitly telling the player, it's able to convey that Phantom's very similar attack could be deflected too. Now this is far too late at this point since you've already fought every possible encounter with Phantom already, and you may have accidentally already discovered it instead. But what this does is set the idea up for you for future playthroughs, like when the game immediately throws you into hard mode upon completion. With this complete, we now have access to the Quicksilver, which will let us go back into the corridor and go through the other door that was previously locked to enter one of the most ornate rooms in the game. And honestly, the one more than any other that has come the closest to translating the game's concept art into 3D. And this is where Nelo Angelo reveals his true form after he's finished aura farming the moment for everything it's worth.
Head to the go-go, baby!
And here we discover that Nelo is not just another demon under Mundus' control, but actually Virgil, Dante's twin brother, meaning that Virgil is still the best boss in the game, even when he's not even one of the options. Nelo 3 can unfortunately look a little bit weird, as this version of the boss fight not only removes the helmet, but also increases the physical size of his model too. And this ends up increasing Virgil's range advantage he already has over you even more. Unfortunately, this means he ends up looking a little bit odd, since all of a sudden your rival is about 2 or 3 feet taller than you, and his head isn't particularly well proportioned. I think if they'd just done one or the other, they could have probably gotten away with it, but by doing both, it makes the whole thing look a little bit uncanny. And not necessarily in a good way. The size change is also just subtle enough to make you question whether or not he was always this height. As for the fight itself, other than the size change and increased stats, it's actually very similar to that of his second encounter. He pretty much retains all of the same moves, with only a few minor changes, like there being less wind up on a bunch of his combos since now he's going all out. He does however gain access to a new set of attacks which have since become one of Virgil's signature techniques, and that that being his summon swords. At certain points during the fight, particularly when you're being a bit too passive, Virgil will teleport into the air and start raining down various different patterns of summon swords at you, all requiring different methods to avoid them, be it dodging, jumping, or even standing perfectly still. While he's in this state, your options are to either wait around until he gets bored and begins fighting normally again, or trying to find some openings to land some hits in, be it via meteor, round trip, or even some grenade gunshots to knock him out of it. Alternatively, standing directly under him or jumping into him with rolling blaze will also get him to stop. And what I like most about this attack is that it's really cool to be able to see all of the moves that would inspire Virgil's various special summon sword techniques like spiral swords and blistering blades later down the road. I think after everything though, the thing I really find interesting about Virgil and Nelo Angelo in this game is all of the subtle nods that this title has towards his personality, despite the fact that he doesn't actually have a single speaking line. From moment one, Dante is already pretty fond of Nelo Angelo, even when he doesn't quite know who he is yet. The guts and honor line is basically brought up twice in some shape or form, and it's not like it's the only time Dante has found some sort of respect for an enemy that he's had to face. This allows for their rival dynamic to flourish even more, despite the fact that they barely interact. At the end of the day, even as Nelo, Virgil will always tick every box for your typical I'm you but stronger type of boss fight. What I feel goes unnoticed, however, is a lot about the situation that Virgil is actually in. Yes, we do get that cutscene at the end of DMC3 where we see Virgil make that last stand against Mundus, which he inevitably loses off screen, and we then know that later on he's mind controlled to be Mundus's puppet. But I feel like if we take a closer look at things and really read into it a bit too much, there's actually a lot more going on here. Firstly, it's very clear that with each passing battle, Virgil is regaining more and more of his mind back, and by the third encounter, he's probably in a Margin Vegeta style state where he is lucid, but Mundus is still able to choose which one of his desires he's prioritizing. Meaning that while he is probably no longer being forced to fight us, he's still doing it for the love of the game. The second thing I want to talk about, however, is why is Nelo Angelo? I mean, yes, the suit of armor is obviously designed as a way of confining Virgil and sealing him away to make him easier to control, but something I've noticed is that Nelo Angelo's design, as well as the final boss arena, is very reminiscent of Sparda himself. Now, we don't actually know all that much about Sparda. Even with 5 games in the series, he's still remained a mystery save for a few second-hand accounts and some basic design elements. But that doesn't mean we can't infer from what we do have. Sparda, based off of his costumes and artwork, is always depicted as some sort of aristocrat, usually dressed in purples, being both a mixture of red and blue, but also a symbol of royalty since historically, purple dye tended to be the hardest to produce. Personally, I've always liked to picture Sparda as this sort of refined but good-natured gentleman who is both simultaneously calm and collected, whilst also being very jovial that allows him to really enjoy his fights and toy with his enemies, just like his various descendants. If he didn't need to go all out, he would simply fight with Force Edge in its base state as if he was fencing, and would taunt his opponent by criticizing their poor form, making suggestions on how to improve, and either forcing them into a blind rage or making it so very clear that they never stood a chance to begin with and eventually got them to join him. And as we all know, while Dante was a mama's boy, Virgil looked up to his dad like a hero, and is still trying to chase down that symbol and idea of who his father was. And so, when we return back to DMC1, we run into Nelo Angelo, a dark knight made in a very similar image to Sparda, standing in this ornate and regal looking throne room waiting to fight Dante. And I just have to ask, is this Mundus giving Virgil this bastardized version of all of his desires, be it either to mock him or to placate his now weakened mind? Spoilers a bit for later, but we do see Mundus make a very similar offer to Dante, trying to tempt him into switching sides. Something that was, in all fairness, probably not genuine, but regardless, the idea that Mundus in some shape or form was able to partly keep Virgil under control by convincing his mind that he was acquiring more power by serving directly under him is a pretty interesting one. Nelo Angelo at the end of the day is a cheap imitation of what Sparda was and what Dante over the course of the game will eventually become. And it's honestly quite tragic to see what has become of Virgil at this one point in his career. This idea is also strengthened by the fact that the corrupted Virgil costume in DMC3, where he wears his father's clothes, also replaces his usual devil trigger with Nelo Angelo instead, implying that this might be what he looks like under all of that armor. Also, his boss theme is very similar to that of the second Sparda costume battle theme. With our brother well and truly gone and dead without a chance of ever coming back, we can now steal his amulet like he once tried with us, and it's here by fusing the two together where we can awaken to our final form and unlock the true power to the Devil Sword Sparda. The DSS is the unleashed version of the Force Edge, and if you look closely you can actually see the original blade embedded within the weapon. Or at the very least, I think it's the original blade. I can't decide on whether or not Force Edge is the original with Sparda being a sort of Bankai of it, or if Sparda is the original with Force Edge being a sort of sealed version. If I had to pick one or the other, I'd probably lean on the latter, where originally Sparda the Sword was just part of the fully gross bug demon that Sparda the Man was, with it being some sort of giant bladed appendage that could shapeshift, and then later on when he gained more and more adoration for mankind, he started to take on a more humanoid form, and this weapon followed suit. Anyway, Sparda the Sword is both insanely cool in terms of its design, but kinda lame when it comes to its gameplay. Its base moveset is exactly the same as Force Edge, with it gaining Stinger and Round Trip if you've purchased those moves for Alistair. Where it differs from those two swords is that the blade is actually able to change shape, switching between a sword, a spear and a scythe depending on what move you're using. And this shapeshifting further increases the already pretty large hitbox that Sparda has. And on top of this, you also gain access to Devil Trigger damage all of the time. The trade-off, however, is that this comes at the cost of actually being able to use Devil Trigger. And while you may very well enjoy the damage buff, the other benefits such as super armor, health regen, faster movement speed, and DT specific attacks like Air Raid will now elude you. And I just think that the trade-off is not particularly worth it most of the time, especially when it also comes at the cost of being able to quick switch to Ifrit whenever you want. And use Nightmare Beta too, I suppose. So because of that, I still like to just use Alistair and Ifrit most of the time. And speaking of quick switching, you may have noticed something here and there throughout my footage. I spoke a little bit earlier about how weapon switch combos do exist in this game, but only via using Round Trip with Alistair. And that is true if you're playing it in a official capacity. But there's actually this quite interesting little mod for DMC1 that is relatively minor, but a really cool way of re-experiencing the game if you're a series vet at this point. And that is the DDMK mod, which I used for my hard and Dante Must Die playthroughs. Now, DDMK is actually a trainer for the entire HD trilogy, and it allows you to do things like quick level select or modify certain values here and there. And it was actually originally designed to help speedrunners and various other types to practice individual sections much easier. But at some point, the DDMK mod started evolving to something more. Many of you probably already know it as the style switching mod for DMC3's PC version, basically implementing all of the benefits of freestyle mode from the Switch release of the game. DMC3 isn't alone in its cool backported mechanics, however, and DMC1 also gained a few cool enhancements that are admittedly nowhere near as impactful as DMC3 getting freestyle mode, but are still worth checking out nonetheless. The first and best little addition is the game gets access to DMC3 style instant weapon switching instead of the relatively slow quick switch it has by default. Compared to DMC3, however, it is regrettably a little bit more jank in its implementation. DMC3's full weapon switching is able to work as well as it does because the game is already built with that system in mind, it's just that the freestyle mode expands what's already there. In DMC1's case, we have no such luxury, and because of that, there's a few complications. The first being that DMC1 really only has 2 melee weapon movesets, so while you can switch between Alistair, Force Edge, Sparda, Ifrit and Yamato, you're still going to be much better off just sticking with Alistair and Ifrit like usual. The other main drawback of weapon switching is that whenever you use it, it causes a 1-frame black flicker as the game swaps out the model and moveset in and out of what I assume is the game's allotted RAM. This is not terribly intrusive since it is a very brief flash and is pretty easy to ignore when focusing on the fight, and regardless to everything else, it's still much quicker than the previous methods of switching, so while it's not perfect, it's still a net gain. Sadly, the opportunities and combo potential that you do gain from having a fast switch are also a lot less useful than you'd think. Yeah, sure, you can do things like launch the enemy with Magma Drive and then juggle them with an Alistair combo, or cancel out of air raid with a dive kick, but the thing about fast weapon switching is that it's more of a catalyst for combo potential than it is an amplifier, and so it can only do so much with a more limited move pool compared to what it brings to DMC3. The other obvious inclusion that they added was quick weapon switching for the guns, which theoretically would be especially useful as there are more of them than close range weapons, and unlike them, they didn't even get a slow quick switch either. Unfortunately, however, it's realistically unusable. See, it works exactly the same as the Devil Arm switcher, where you can set up how many slots you want and what order you want to rotate in between them. The only difference being that it's tied to the left trigger instead of the right one, just like you'd expect from DMC3. The problem is that the game will crash whenever you try and switch guns whilst there's an already existing projectile on screen. And this isn't a case of, oh, I just shot Nightmare Beta, I need to make sure not to switch to Ebony and Ivory while it's still bouncing around the room. This crash will happen with any projectile, even if it's a demon puppet throwing a dagger at you from off screen. And a lot of the game's projectiles technically linger for a lot longer than they're actually active for. Now, you could theoretically just not press it during fights and only use it as a quick switch during quiet times in between encounters. But to me, that sounds like having a button on my keyboard that is mildly useful, but if I accidentally press it whenever sound is playing, then it will delete System 32. At the end of the day, no matter how much of a benefit it gives you, it's incredibly stressful and doesn't feel like it's worth the trouble. So alas, even though it is technically there, we can't really enjoy fast gun switching, not in the way that the mod currently exists at least. There are, however, a few extra consolidation prizes available, some of which only sometimes cause the game to crash. The ones that I didn't use because they do cause a couple of problems and are a little bit broken are the various sword fix toggles. These allow you to do things like equip Dante with Yamato and use Stinger and Round Trip when fighting with Force Edge. The most notable one, however, is the ability to use Devil Trigger when equipped with Sparda. It's a really cool one to play around with, but it does cause you to realise how OP Sparda would be in normal gameplay and why it had its DT removed. What I did end up using, however, is stuff like the toggle that allows you to use Air Hike no matter what weapon you've got equipped, something that becomes especially potent when used with Ifrit thanks to Rolling Blaze. The other option is the alternate charge shot method for the guns, which lets you use Devil Power infused charge shots without needing to hold down the lock on, letting you retain full free movement whilst charging. This is one that I didn't use all that often because I always feel like Dante's charge shots are kinda weak and as a result just kind of forget about them. But I did end up finding a very funny glitch with this one. You're also given the ability to map the charge and gun buttons to any other on the controller. Since fast gun switching wasn't going to be an option at this point, I really like the idea of mapping this to the left trigger as a secondary shoot button so it'd be much easier to charge shots up during a combo. The thing is, however, when we do this, we end up seeing some really weird behavior at play. And when we do this, trying to charge on an alternate button will actually end up causing your gun to start auto-firing normal shots once it's fully charged. For example, I'm not pressing the shoot button here, but Ebony and Ivory are firing a very slow barrage of normal shots just by holding down that charge button. This is a little bit clunky with Ebony and Ivory, but we get a very different reaction when we use it with the shotgun and grenade launcher. For whatever reason, doing this exact same thing with the grenade gun will cause it to fire at double speed even without rolling. Which, considering how broken the grenade gun already is, this is ridiculous. The shotgun, however, is even more insane, with this glitch practically giving it a full auto setting. Which, as you can tell, is a little broken. But what really takes the cake is that by jumping in this rapid fire state, you'll switch from your normal shots to your charged ones. which is only making them more OP and ridiculous. Needless to say, it is a pretty funny glitch, but it's going to ruin the hell out of the game's balancing if you decide to abuse it in any shape or form. As for the actual level of Mission 18, it's honestly pretty worthy of glazing over, since there's not too much going on here other than getting to try out Sparda for the first time. It starts off with you going for a portal outside of Nelo Free's arena into this underground section, and I hope you're excited because we get to see the return of everyone's favourite underwater controls. This section is pretty brief, in fact even more so than the previous one, and it's pretty much the only notable thing in the level until you get to the boss. You get to fight some Sin Scissors underwater for a bit, and what's fun about them here is that you can still kill them with that same critical hit method as you can do on the ground, and since the needle gun fires in bursts, it's actually very easy to kill them with a single button press. In the end, making this section arguably even easier than the previous one. As for the boss, we just need to fight Nightmare again in the arena we originally encountered our first Shadow in, and the jammy bastard decides to show up just as we're in the middle of cooking our Philosopher's Omelette. Nightmare 2 is very similar to the first fight. You're in a smaller arena, there's only 2 switches on the walls to turn the lights on, and this time the Hell Dimension will take you to fight Griffon as the mini-boss instead, but other than that, the only thing you're going to encounter is a brand new attack in the form of this boomerang move. It'll move around the arena in a figure 8 speed and gradually picks up more and more speed, but if you're able to parry it pretty early, it's very easy to get rid of. The best way to do so is just by jumping into it with Rolling Blaze as soon as it comes out. And in by doing so, you'll also expose the core for longer than usual to let yourself get some hits in. Either way, just like before, you want to try and take out the cores with as few as hits as possible while spreading out the damage between the 2 of them and the mini-boss. And once you beat the fight, Nightmare will once again run away. Mission 19 starts immediately after the boss fight, and we get another one of these teleporter circles that exists solely to keep you moving forward, since the back-end level design of this game is reusing a lot of assets without cleverly putting them together. And so we end up going from some really well constructed level design to just warping around from place to place. It's not the worst thing in the world, but considering they are reusing assets and to a very strict degree, I imagine it would have been really hard to get this area done right. And I suppose it does end up cutting down the amount of empty backtracking that would really slow down the pace as we build up to our grand finale. Now, this mission's pretty short and doesn't really have any story or boss fights in it, but it is the one where we get to enter the previously mentioned mirror dimension and also encounter our final new enemy type. To get to the mirror dimension, we need to take the elixir that we got from cooking the Philosopher's Egg to a mirror, and so naturally we should still remember of such a mirror in Nelo's first introduction cutscene. So all we need to do is head back to the 2 paintings on the broken bridge and jump on through. Now that we can access the mirror dimension, we can now head outside to an eerie, disturbing version of the balcony and courtyard and grab ourselves the Philosopher's Stone. And it's here where we get ambushed by the nobodies, these deformed, twisted beings that look like humans melded together and make these incredibly unsettling noises. And oh look, is that a giant eyeball from William Birkin from the hit game Resident Evil 2? Speaking of which, did you know that this game was originally going to be Resident Evil 4? The nobodies themselves are actually pretty simple to deal with, particularly the small ones being not really much of a problem at all. They've only got a couple of attacks and don't really do all that much damage, but they can hit and stun you, leaving you open for the much bigger ones to swoop in, which after fighting them for a bit, a second cutscene will activate, showing that any one of them can become a larger one just by wearing one of these stone masks. Holy fucking shit, is that a motherfucking JoJo reference? Anyway, the larger nobodies are actually more of a threat even by themselves and are particularly annoying thanks to this incredibly quick jump attack that's really hard to react to. None of the nobodies can be launched per se, but you can use your launchers to put them into this more passive, comboable state when they're small. Realistically though, the best way to deal with them is just by spamming Inferno over and over, since this will kill the small ones outright and break the mass to the larger ones, making them small again. The last 2 things that you need to be careful of is that firstly, they can sap your DT gauge much like Nightmare can, so it's best advised to use it when you still have it, or at the very least use Sparda so you have no DT for them to drain in the first place. Finally, the nobodies' bodies are extremely volatile. Their eyeballs will pop off and bounce on the ground trying to hit you and explode, which means that they can act as some excellent sporadic and really effective area denial, and this can be especially annoying whenever you're trying to combo them. On top of this, their corpses will also pop and explode for several seconds after dying, which means that they give you something to worry about even after taking each one out. Now that we've been introduced to every single enemy type in the game, one thing that I think is really worth mentioning is that DMC1 actually has a very detailed Beastiary that fills up every time you discover something new about an enemy. Seeing a specific attack or getting something like one of those critical hit kills accidentally will add these extra notes to the journal, filling them out. What is particularly useful about this is that it means that even a game like DMC1 that doesn't hold your hand or throw information at you is still able to give you a lifeline to explain exactly what you're looking at, but in a way that never has to interrupt the flow of gameplay to do so. But what I really like about this is that on top of the useful information, there's also quite a bit of flavor text. The journal entries, as well as many of the other dialogue boxes that you'll encounter as you explore and examine things in the environment, are actually all told from Dante's perspective, and it gives us an extra little look into his personality outside of the pretty sparse cutscenes. And the version of Dante that we see here is actually a lot more put together than we're usually led to believe based on all of his other portrayals. Not just the portrayals from other games, but also to an extent the ones from the cutscenes of this game too, further hinting at the idea that a lot of Dante's outwards personality is just a front of theatrics, and that the mind underneath is actually quite mature and intelligent when it wants to be. Now, I'm not saying that later entries in DMC have flanderized the character or anything, because that's honestly not the case. It's just that with a more limited amount of screen time in each DMC game, we just don't get to see as much of Dante as I would reasonably like to see. And it's just a shame that we don't get to see this side of Dante, because it is a side of his character, it's just very, very well hidden. The original concept for the character was always supposed to be a sort of cool, calm, collected British detective who was able to be a bit sassy. And while that certainly has changed, it is a bit of a shame that we only get to see it here and there in places like the old Madhouse anime, and to a lesser extent in parts of DMC4. Ultimately, I just need the lie that Virgil is smarter because he reads the occasional dusty old poetry book instead of a magazine to end, because the truth is they're both performatively stupid. Now, there's actually something else that I've been meaning to bring up, and that's that surprisingly there's quite a bit of lore and story that can be implied and inferred by much of the game's art direction, as well as the little nuggets of information that you get whenever Dante examines something. DMC1 is absolutely rife with symbolism alluding to the occult, more specifically in alchemy, namely the repeated use of the 8-pointed star that does have different meanings in different cultures, but for alchemy represents creation. We see it all over the place in the environment, on switches, and in items like the elixir and the philosopher's stone, along with various alchemic symbols for things like lead and gold. Maxterat has a pretty good video going over all of this stuff in more detail if you're interested, but what I want to talk about is why all of this is here from a more narrative perspective. Mundus owns this island, that much is incredibly obvious, but it's also very clear that it was also inhabited by relatively ordinary humans at some point in time. Yes, there are a collection of different trinkets and MacGuffins from various different time periods, but the castle and a lot of the architecture itself is very much inspired by an original 12th century castle. And I believe that it was Mundus's influence that came later that caused the island to start moving about the ocean randomly and slowly drove the Castellans mad to make more and more modifications to it. The question is, to what end? Well, some of them were obviously just there to stroke his ego, to have the people of Malay Island worship him like the god that he sees himself as. But from all of this alchemic symbology and the various different enemy types that we have to encounter, I think it becomes increasingly clear that this was Mundus's personal laboratory of the occult, one where he planned and created new types of demons to take his revenge with. And so he took over the island and influenced its residents to retrofit it for his own gains. Because while we're explicitly told about Nightmare being an artificial demon, there's actually a bunch more in this game too. Nightmare, Griffon and the Shadows all possess very similar looking cores within them, which are funnily enough the three that V was also able to recreate and control in DMC5. But these cores are all very obvious signs that each one of them are very different to your standard type of demon, like the blades for example, and hint to the fact that each one of them are artificially created, or at the very least in Griffon's case, enhanced. The shadows actually possess a lot in common with Nightmare, being these goopy shape-shifting beings that have all sorts of weapons that can spawn out of their ever-changing forms. Griffon, on the other hand, is said to be one of Mundus's oldest allies before even Sparda's uprising. That does kind of complicate things, but honestly I could see in his early research into finding out how to create brand new demonic life, Mundus may have tested out trying to recreate or revive an already existing but ultimately dead or almost dead soul. Maybe Sparda gravely injured Griffon or something during the final days of the war, since he does seem pretty familiar with his strength, and so Mundus decided that he could still be useful as a test subject. Other aspects that support this Mundus is a scientist and an alchemist idea is the info that we got later in DMC4, where Agnes mentions how hard and difficult it was to infuse the souls of demons into the Order's suits of armor to control them. This is something Mundus already has experience with, being a demon himself, so I imagine he found it significantly easier, but fundamentally, the Angelos from DMC4 and the marionettes from DMC1 are the exact same type of demon, it's just that one is of a much higher caliber. Finally, this last example could be a bit of a stretch, but honestly it's too fun of a horrifying thought process to not bring up. And that's that the nobodies are described as demonic beings that are so looked down upon by the other denizens of the demon world that they're not even given a proper name. But there are many other types of demons that seem to be far less capable than the nobodies, and yet apparently don't warrant the same type of treatment. Pairing this with the fact that their original design is clearly meant to be some sort of G-virus variant of the Lickers from Resident Evil 2, and I think it's very clear that nobodies were originally humans that have been reborn together into disgusting affronts to life itself to create a brand new type of demon, and it would also explain why others from Hell are so disgusted by their appearance as well. I think what further backs this point up is that while Mundus originally had a use for the human residents of the island, at some point this all stopped. We can find in the text within the library and the bedroom that as time went on, the later Castellans of Malay Island would impose excessively high taxes and deliver barbaric punishments, as it becomes more and more clear that the influence Mundus had over their minds was getting stronger and stronger. Now, these barbaric punishments could be anything, but if nobodies are in fact made of human, then a good source of getting new ones to experiment on is the ones you've got imprisoned already. And since nobodies have a very similar DT draining power as Nightmare does, it would make sense that they're a sort of testing bed for that particular ability. And the last puzzle piece to my argument is the behaviour of these demons themselves. For a demon that is supposedly of incredibly low intelligence, they do seem to disturbingly sing and chirp an awful lot, almost as if they're trying to communicate but can't. And their wearing of the stone mask feels like a sort of poetic prosthetic in a feeble attempt of regaining their humanity that they've had stolen from them. Finally, this could just be Devil May Cry 5 creating more links between V and DMC1, but when we first see the nobodies return in that game, it is a group of 3 of them worshipping the devil sword Sparda. And I think it's pretty reasonable behaviour for a being that only has a sliver of who they once were still inside them to be praying to the one thing that may have saved them in the past to help them once again. Now, there is actually one more artificial demon that I need to talk about, but we'll save her for the next section since it's at the end of Mission 20 where we can really cut loose on that front. Mission 20 begins our descent into Hell itself, and interestingly, this first room is actually us re-entering the mirror dimension before doing so, re-solidifying it as this sort of middle ground between the two worlds. Which makes sense why Mundus would keep Nightmare and Virgil in these two spaces, because they're the two things he's struggling to control. For this mission, however, as the name suggests, it mostly just acts as a true final showdown with Nightmare, and our actual level going through Hell will come later, as this one's really only a couple of rooms, and we only really need to fight our way through 2 frosts and cut open some pulsating sphincters before we get to the boss. And when we get there, we're met with an arena that is extremely visually striking, being this cave whose ceiling is littered with the same demonic runes that make up our devil trigger gauge that illuminate as the lights go dark and Trish begs for our help from Nightmare's wrath. Like before, Nightmare 3 is very similar to its first 2 encounters, with the big changes at least at the start of the fight being an even smaller arena and a new mini-boss fight when being captured in the form of Nelo Angelo. The arena being this small thanks to the barrier that Nightmare puts up is honestly the biggest difficulty modifier here, since at this point you're fighting in such a small enclosed space that the chances of auto-locking onto Nightmare when you're trying to hit the light switch is higher than ever. The other reason why this fight is considered so difficult is because at this point you've probably at least broken one of Nightmare's cores already, making it an uphill battle of attrition right from the start. There is, however, a bit of a cinematic twist to this fight when Nightmare reaches 25% health, where a cutscene will activate revealing that Trish was a traitor working for Mundus this whole time and will now intermittently be pelting you with lightning bolts for the rest of the fight. Which sounds like it could be a big problem, but if I'm perfectly honest, I've played through this game a good number of times now, and I don't even really register them. Supposedly, they don't do that much damage but do leave you stunned, meaning that Nightmare can get more hits in on you. But on top of all of the other bullshit that you have to deal with within the Nightmare encounters, it's just another blip hiding amongst everything else that's happening on screen. And to me, what actually makes Trish more of an annoyance is the fact that her cutscene causes all of the lights to turn off, cutting whatever combo that you were doing short. Finally, once you deplete Nightmare's health bar for the third time, it will completely regenerate and expose its true final core as it starts spamming attacks in every and all directions. Luckily, despite its full heal, this final core is extremely susceptible to damage, and you don't have to worry about cracking it any more than it currently is. And so, something like Air Raid is now an extremely useful and safe way to finish it off if you start doing it early enough to not lock onto its various projectiles instead. With Nightmare properly and truly killed, the cave starts to crumble a bit, and despite everything, Dante runs to save his would-be betrayer.
Dante! Dante, why did you save my life?
Because I wanted you to peg me. You can consider this my last Twitch donation. Don't come any closer, you harlot! I thought you could be my big titty goth girl dummy mommy milkers GF, but I was wrong! You're just an e-girl thought like all the rest. And so, now that Mundus' Discord kitten has failed him, a terrible fate lies in wait for her. And I think that now is as good a time as any to talk about Trish in a bit more detail. Because I feel like of everybody in the core cast of DMC, Trish is the one who's gotten the short end of the stick the most. Sure, she is up there as a main character, being only one level below protagonist rank, but the only game she's predominantly featured in is one with barely any cutscenes and one where she's doing a lot of stuff off screen for the most part. And hell, considering she's working for Mundus, one has to wonder what she's even getting up to. I feel really bad because I'm definitely 100% Team Lady, but I also feel like it's not even a fair competition. Even in the DMC anime, Trish spends most of her time mysteriously absent, only showing up for one episode and then the ending. And this is because they relegated her adventures during this time to a couple of audio dramas, which is frankly just kinda depressing. She did get to do a bit more in DMC 4 and 5 than Lady did, getting to play espionage and listening to V's trauma dumping, but for the most part they both got relegated to just doing all of their cool shit off screen. The difference between them is that at least Lady managed to get one good narrative before she was relegated to such a position, and she's been more prominently featured in various spin-off media. Also, to add insult to injury, Trish's character arc and story was basically recycled and reused for Lucia's as well, which admittedly does take more away from her since she came second, but it certainly doesn't do Trish any favors. To me, Trish is such a well of untapped potential because there's so many different places you could go with her character, and we just haven't. The idea of a demon like herself going good is such a rare concept within this world. So rare in fact that the last time this happened, it completely changed the entire dynamic of the two realities and established the core setting for the games. Sure, as time has gone on we have seen more examples, but it's still not exactly common, and many of these cases, such as demons who are still loyal to Sparda, were exactly that, loyal to Sparda. Without his influence, they'd go right back into being bad guys again. She also represents the other side of the coin to so much the messaging and theming to both DMC 1 and DMC as a series. Dante is a character who has to deal with multiple questions about family, legacy, acceptance, and his humanity as somebody who is half demon. But something I've always overlooked until making this video is that while Dante is a son of Sparda, Trish is a child of Mundus. Something that is far more interesting than the whole weird Oedipus complex thing she has going on with Dante is that the two of them, as far as backgrounds go, are polar opposites, and they've just done nothing with that. If Devil May Cry 1 does ever get a remake or a reimagining, there's very little I'd realistically want them to change. I could think of quite a few things that I'd recommend as small subtle changes, but for the most part I'd want them to keep that more grounded feel. I'll share some of those ideas at the end of the video as a little bonus, but I think narratively the thing I'd really love them to do is expand on Trish's character. For example, why was she able to turn good after a single act when she was made by Mundus for the specific reason of killing Dante? Like, is it specifically because she's a demon designed to look and appear human that she was able to retain some human traits? Because the implication I've always gotten is that despite being a demon, this is Trish's true form. Her devil trigger design has always just been that she puts some shades on and starts glowing yellow, which is granted probably due to budgetary reasons, but personally I just think it's more interesting to go, oh yeah, that's just what Trish looks like as a demon. Maybe at most her eyes go funny when she goes all out, which is why she has to wear the shades. Alas, it's just a fun food for thought, and there's a lot of different ways the devs could take things, but ultimately I'm still just mad that Ladies' Night got scrapped. Moving on to Mission 21, this is our one and only true level going through hell, and our final normal level of the game, as everything left after this is just boss fights and set pieces. And it's pretty much everything you'd expect from a hellish landscape at this point. It's a nice mixture of fire and brimstone, but also that eldritch horror of realizing that this entire cave system appears to be alive. It's all very appropriately hellish, but at this point, aesthetically, it's not really anything we haven't seen before. Also, at this point, any semblance of involved level design and puzzles have all been thrown out the window, as this is your final stretch and swelling crescendo before the game's climax. Again, it's not really a bad thing for pacing, but it is something to mention. Mission 21 also has the game's final secret mission in it, which is particularly of note since it's the only secret mission that doesn't give you a blue orb fragment and instead gives you an item called the Bangle of Time. This is something you'll be very familiar with if you know about the Quicksilver style from DMC 3, and equipping it will allow you to swap out the ability to activate Devil Trigger with one to slow down time instead. It's a really cool feature that you'll likely not use very much, because while it is crazy cool, it's just nowhere near as useful as DT. The secret mission itself that you get it in also lets you fulfill the fantasy of actually fighting the giant skeleton dinosaur who's waiting for you after you sent him to hell. It's a very straightforward secret mission, and it doesn't have some sort of advanced game tutorial hidden within it, and the fight with the undead T-Rex is not terribly fun either, but it is a funny thing to hide right at the end of the game. Other than that, however, there's really not all that much to talk about in this level. It's pretty much just a straight shot to the end that just goes, yeah, play the mission and beat it, dude. There is this maze section that has these new graboid hazards that you need to be careful of, as while you can swing at them to force them to retract, they always come back immediately afterwards. And if you let them latch onto you, they'll individually start draining your HP as you run through them. One of them is not that big of a problem, but we're talking clusters of like 5, 10, 15 of them at a time, making them really dangerous if you just run through them, especially on higher difficulties. There is also some pretty neat speedrunning tech in this mission if you have Vortex level 2, where in this little vertical cavern area you can lock onto a plasma bat off screen, and if you line it up correctly you can fly all the way to the top of the area without having to scale up the outside walls and jutting platforms. Something I also like about this level is that hitting the final switch that unseals the barrier on the door to Mundus' throne room actually causes like 10 different barrier hands to shatter all at once, and it's a nice little extra touch to make this door in particular feel very final and special. And so we're finally here, our stage for the grand finale, locked away deep within hell itself, and it's strangely angelic and ethereal. This is actually one of my favourite visual cues and design concepts for hell that I've ever seen, and we do see it repeated throughout the series here and there. But I do really like the idea that devils and demons are so incredibly vain that at some point naturally they'll carve out their own section of hell to look outlandishly grand and heavenly despite everything existing around them. It will look pure and beautiful if you forget where this area exists and what surrounds it, but otherwise it comes across artificial and fake. I also really like how even though the throne room is made of like marble or alabaster or something, it's not pure white or silver or whatever. It's got this very kind of grungy grey to it. It's gleaming, but it isn't radiant, and I don't know if that's an intentional design choice or if it's just a limitation of the PS2. Nevertheless, it means that all of the surfaces can still have a shine to them while still looking grungy and fake looking. And speaking of fake, we walk forward to face down Mundus, who is talking to us through a statue of himself as he deems it not worthy to appear in person. And honestly, he's kinda right to, since all it took was using Trish as a hostage for him to be able to get some good hits on Dante even when operating for a false idol of himself. Upon seeing him take damage, Trish looks like she wakes up from a pretend sleep and breaks out of her clearly unbound handcuffs, thanks HD collection, to push Dante out of the way to get hit herself. And this right here is where Dante develops the mystical power of laser eyes.
How much longer are you going to keep zapping?
This is a subtle hint from Kamiya that he wants everybody to stop playing RE2. And it's here where the giant great statue of Mundus starts to crumble as we get to see what he truly looks like underneath. That being another giant statue.
Check it out. It's got wings.
This one, however, looking much more like a Zeus-like figure, which is oddly fitting since he's still depicting himself as a god, but one who's a real bastard on top of it all. And we also have a empty hollow chest to represent the lack of a heart that the demon has, which is an obvious but nice little touch. Mundus is somehow able to take us to space, also known as the framerate dimension, and it offers to make Dante all of the dommy mommies he could ever possibly want. Luckily our boy knows not to make deals with the devil, and at this point he's so angry he's seeing red anyway. We then both fly higher than outer space and somehow end up in the clouds like we're in Dark Souls 2 or something, and the first phase of Mundus's boss fight begins. And thus also begins a long Kamiya tradition of forcing gimmicky Space Harrier / Afterburner sections into his games, all of which are not very good. What is however pretty cool and climactic about this part of the story is this is when Dante finally uses Devil Trigger whilst drawing on the power of the Devil Sword Sparda instead of just Alistair and Ifrit. And as a result, we don't just transform into our demon form, we take on the visage of Sparda himself. Something I quite like here is the implication that being deep within hell itself means that the atmosphere allows Dante to use DT powers that he otherwise wouldn't be able to. After all, it would be pretty stupid if demons were allergic to their own climate.
This is so freaking cool. So is it going to be an animated series? I mean, which characters are you going to pull from? I'm a huge Virgil fan. I freaking love Virgil. And Trish, Lady, they're dope. So yeah, who are you thinking for characters?
You're a Virgil fan?
Yeah, I love Virgil.
You also a Thanos fan?
Unfortunately, this fight gets especially butchered in the HD collection, with so many different visual effects being broken that pretty much the entire spectacle and benefit of it being a set piece is kind of ruined. So many different things like heat distortion coming off of attacks, and animations of lasers not actually playing, and the spinning of these sigil blasts that you send at him all being absent, makes this fight look incredibly bland and boring in comparison. The fight is already not particularly great, so taking away the one thing it does have going for it makes it especially bad. Now, what you're supposed to do in this fight is to blast away at the orb shielding Mundus so you can start attacking him directly, and doing so by mashing the square button as fast as possible, since you're able to fire as quick as you can press that button. But honestly, between the ruined visuals and the not exactly most interesting busting shooter mechanic, I've always just gobbled up my surplus supply of Devil Stars and used my DT meter to send multiple Puff the Magic Dragons his way to skip the fight. What I will say that I was surprised to learn is that pressing the melee button during this part of the fight will cause Dante to perform Vortex, which does seem useless at first, but then I realized that it not only gives you iframes to dodge attacks, but you can actually hit Mundus with it whenever he tries to fly over you and switch sides. And if you do, it actually does a crazy good amount of damage, which is honestly probably the key to making this encounter slightly less miserable. Who would have thought that the game plays better when you're not directly making it worse by not using mechanics you didn't realize were there. With this phase complete with both of our wings clipped, we can now sink down into this literal hellhole so we can have our actual final boss battle. And there's a lot about this fight that the game just doesn't tell you. Firstly, the most obvious thing is that we now have access to Devil Trigger whilst using Sparda, with DT not only increasing our damage but also giving us an extended hitbox that essentially doubles the already crazy range Sparda already has. What's less obvious is that the game also replaces your guns with these fireball punches while in DT. What's even less clear than that, however, is that exclusively in this fight, by holding down the shoot button while in Devil Trigger, you're actually able to use Meteor from Ifrit's moveset. This by itself only does slightly higher DPS than just spamming those tiny fireballs, but if you are choosing to fight at range, you can very easily use Round Trip first and spend the time Sparda's grinding away at Mundus to charge up your meteors to be as damage efficient as possible. Ideally, however, the game wants you to get up on these platforms and use your extended DT range to get up in Mundus's grill and attack him directly, which is definitely faster but much more risky. The problem with this, however, is that with DMC1's kind of clunky platforming and the gaps in between each of the rocks that you have to jump on, it's very possible to misjudge a jump where you'll just fall in and start taking damage very quickly. Luckily, the devs did know that this would pose a bit of a problem, and as such do give you back air hike even though you don't normally have it when you're equipped with Sparda, which is something else that the game doesn't tell you. Now, if you enter this phase of the fight with enough DT gauge and you're lucky enough with Mundus's animations, you can actually blitz through it very quickly. This footage on screen right now is actually me going through a New Game Plus hard mode playthrough, and as you can see, I basically took him out with a single cycle of DT. But it's very likely that you came into this second phase of the fight with not much DT because you used your dragon attack to finish the first phase off. And if that's the case, you're going to be in a bit of an awkward situation since you're going to have to let the fight drag on enough to really let Mundus get going. Luckily, this is where the other useful tips that the game doesn't really tell you about come into play. For starters, the orbs that Mundus summons to do various attacks with can be damaged and destroyed. This isn't usually worth your time with the small ones since they do pretty low damage and usually miss anyway, but by doing so you are eliminating a source of potential attacks. The big ones, on the other hand, absolutely are worth dealing with, not because they're inherently dangerous by themselves, but by breaking them you actually get a huge chunk of DT back. And doing so also weakens one of Mundus's more deadly attacks, where he absorbs all of these orbs and converts them into energy to throw them at you. The more orbs that you destroy, the less of these mini nukes he'll be able to throw in his barrage, which is really bloody important since these things will not only destroy the platforms that you want to stand on, but will also always hit you since a full barrage lasts longer than all of the iframes in your dodge. You can, however, deflect them, so if you're feeling ballsy enough, you can play some tennis and take off a huge chunk of Mundus's health bar. The other destructible that Mundus will summon is his very own fiery dragon that will fly around and be a nuisance. However, this is actually a blessing in disguise as well, since killing this thing will make it drop a large green orb that will give you a full health bar back, making this your new best friend for anybody who does phase 1 legit. This second phase is nowhere near as annoying as the first, but it is still putting spectacle over actual good character action gameplay, which does cause it to be a little bit funky. And so it's not exactly the most grand way to wrap up the game. But honestly, I think if you know about all of this extra stuff, this boss is actually not really all that bad in the end. It's certainly better than a lot of people would leave you to believe. And even if you do still hate it, just like how you can use Devil Stars to skip the first phase, you can use Untouchables to skip this one too. All you need to do is pop the item, jump into the onsen with the creepy old man, and start slashing away at his crotch. Wait, what? Something I think is a really neat touch to these Mundus fights is that he's actually using quite a few different moves that were either taken straight from other bosses or at the very least are very similar to them. The lava pillars and meteors that he can throw at you are stolen straight from Phantom, his machine gun hand laser barrages are something he takes from Nightmare, and his lightning attacks from his first phase are a different colour but are effectively the exact same attacks from Griffon. It is cliche video game design 101, but it's a bit of a trope for a reason. The whole point of a boss fight in a game is that it's the culmination of all of the challenges you've had to encounter at the same time. And while Mundus isn't quite that mechanically, he does fit into that role thematically. Anyway, with Mundus finally defeated and disintegrating away, we're able to return to his throne room to brood over a dead Trish, and even though you've very likely seen it a million times before, I know you love it, so we're just gonna roll the clip.
Say the line, Bart!
I should have been the one to fill your dark soul with light!
This line is so goddamn iconic for all of the wrong reasons, and I love it so much for it. I do feel really bad for Drew Coombs, since I think for the most part in this game he does a pretty good job of voice acting, and what probably happened is that his voice cracked during the recording session, and he probably wanted to do another take, but whoever the voice director was like, no, yeah bro, it sounds great, keep going. Since this was during the era of people putting voice acting in video games, but also simultaneously not really giving a shit about it outside of a few standout cases. In DMC1's case, however, since Capcom did publish it and there was no Japanese dub of the game, I can very easily see this being a Resident Evil 1 situation.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
One where instead of it being that the voice director didn't care, it was that the voice director didn't speak a lick of English. I also don't think that the scene is particularly helped by the lack of the intense blur effect that is supposed to kick in when the camera pans up that's absent in the HD collection either. But ultimately, I think it's weird, since as hokey as this moment and pretty much the entirety of this game's writing is, especially throughout this entire ending sequence, I do think that specific elements of this scene, like Trish's theme being used, are actually done very well here. Like, I can see what they're trying to go for here, but how it ends up playing out makes it just become laughable. But I'd never go as far to say that it's a shame, because it does. I wouldn't want it any other way, and honestly, as unintentional and moment-ruining as this line read is, it never fails to fill me and just about every single DMC fan with glee whenever they hear it. And that's the thing. The story of this game is kind of all over the place. The pacing's bad, it's not really fleshed out in all of the ways that it needs to be, and as I've kind of shown throughout this video, it really only starts to gain any sort of real depth with the help of sequels, prequels, and external media. But while part of me can take a critical lens to all of this, there's another part of me that's just sitting there asking, so what? I could sit here and yap on about the meaning behind Dante leaving the Sparda with Trish, symbolising the reunion of his father and mother, but in a bittersweet way, as neither of them are actually there and it's only beings that represent them. Or I could go full cinema sins and complain that Dante is leaving the full power of the Sparda and the amulets in hell for any demon to come across and take for their own. Or I could just laugh at how cheesy it all is and tell you it's bad. But of those three options, one is probably trying a little too hard, the second is annoying as all hell, and the last is just kind of reductive. At the end of the day, there's so much about this entire ending sequence that really just stands out and leaves an impression, and so whether I think it's good or bad, the truth is it's incredibly memorable, and that's far more important. Lines like, I should have been the one to fill your dark soul with light, and what am I fighting for, may be objectively terrible, but the thing about art is that it's incredibly subjective. And something that's this bad ends up resonating with far more people than something that's just pretty damn good. And this is where, once again, we're looping back round to the original thesis of this video. The era that this video game was made in causes the cutscenes and story to be very lackluster from a critical point of view, but what is there is passion, and a lot of it, and that's what ends up coming through and feeling palpable. So much of the story, dialogue and writing has aged like milk, but become a very acquired taste in the process. There's so many people out there who recoil or at the very least try to enjoy DMC despite how they feel about this stuff. And this cheesy hokiness has never really gone away, it's always popped up throughout the series in some shape or form. But to the majority of us DMC fans, those of us who are chuny as all hell, the ones who have acquired this taste of mouldy cheese, this shit's just the best. With that all being said, we are however not quite done yet, so before we can truly wrap things up, we need to talk about Mission 23, the final mission of the game, and our victory lap out of Hell and Malay Island. This is basically a Metroid-style escape sequence. We've got 5 minutes to get out of Hell and get off the island, so let's go. This mission actually makes it very clear just how close the beginning and end of the game actually are to each other. Because even though there are a couple of forced encounters here and there, 5 minutes is actually more than enough to beat this level. Especially since we don't even need to fully escape, we just need to get to the biplane room where a cutscene will activate and Mundus will bust out of a magic sigil in one last attempt to finish us off.
Hey Dante, check it out, I got ChatGPT to generate me a new body. You won't believe how many fingers I have now!
And this is actually really cool for two different reasons. Firstly, it means that just like all of the other boss fights, Mundus is someone we have to take on 3 different times, tying everything together in this neat little way. But more importantly, I really love how this reveals that underneath that regal statue, Mundus is actually a vain, disgusting, amorphous blob monster with eyes and hands and tendrils emerging from every square inch of itself. Despite all of his former grandeur, Mundus is actually this pathetic little creature. And that point is really driven home by the fact that this final fight is actually pretty easy. You don't even have Sparda anymore, but you don't need it, since at this point all Mundus is really able to do is flail around and crawl closer. He does start to grow those same worm things that we found in Hell that drain your life, so if you do take too long killing him, you do unfortunately get sucked to death as he backs you into a wall, but realistically that's not gonna happen. Once we get him down to low health, a cutscene will play where he starts mocking us about how Dante is too weak to kill him now since they're now in the human world, which is further proof to what I was talking about with him unlocking the Sparda earlier. And we have to be saved by Mother, who is miraculously alive again, and Spirit Bomb shares her lightning powers with us so we can set up one final finishing barrage of blasts so we can end this game in the exact same way we started it.
It looks like we have a winner.
Jackpot.
After finally and truly killing Mundus, we have an awkward hug with Trish where we realise that she can be our Dommy Mommy GF, as Dante explains to her that tears are a gift that only humans can possess. All the while, Trish looks like she's tripping balls. As we get ready to abandon all hope from crushing to death, the biplane from earlier drops through the ceiling, and we play through one final minigame section that's nearly impossible to lose to finally escape Malay Island. And since we're finally at the end, I want to talk about the themes of DMC1 as well as the series in general, and by extension just a little bit as to why the Netflix show is such a bad adaptation. There's a lot of different elements to the message behind DMC, especially as new games come and go, but above all else, it's about heritage, family, legacy, and acceptance. I'm not going to pretend that this series is actually some deep philosophical masterclass of writing, but it does take its simple themes and conveys them extremely well. The idea that even a devil may cry, or rather in this game that devils never cry, is that one is able to surpass who they are and where they come from to be a good person despite everything else. The idea that empathy, even if it might not necessarily be inherent to who you are, is something that we can all conjure up. And it doesn't matter who you are or where you come from, anybody is capable of waking up to justice and being more than what they're supposedly destined to be. And ultimately, it's their actions now that make them a good person, or human, opposed to a monster or a devil. DMC 3 and 4 tackles this too from another angle, explaining that at the end of the day it works both ways, and while a devil can choose to be good, it's just as easy, if not easier, for a human to be more evil than any demon. Our humanity is not only what connects each of us together, but it's also what makes us stronger than any monster banging in the night. And that any power we might possess is ultimately useless if we sacrifice our humanity to get it. Characters like Arkham, Agnes, Sanctus, and later Virgil all make the same mistake of giving up their humanity to pursue a greater power for one reason or another. If you want to believe it was originally for a noble cause, you certainly can, but the truth is they all abandoned what they might have stood for trying to gain a way to protect it, even though, ironically, they lost that in the process of doing so. Meanwhile, Sparda, Trish, and Lucia all found that power within themselves already, trying to protect what they believed was important in seemingly selfless acts. They were all able to do this despite their heritage as demons. The DMC Netflix show also tries to attempt this kind of idea with the whole not all demons are inherently evil trope by showing them being depicted as refugees from a war-torn world in some not so subtle imagery, whilst at the same time it shows Dante accept his demon side, the very same heritage that these poor innocents seem to be from, and claim that while in his DT state he was fueled by nothing but anger and hatred, implying that that is the natural state of demons, which has some very questionable implications about the nice demons and their real-life allegories. As for Dante himself, however, his story is more about living up to and fulfilling his father's legacy. We know from the other games that Dante doesn't particularly have the greatest opinion of his father and doesn't really want to live in his footsteps, but despite that, he knows that it's the right thing to do and does it begrudgingly. And so Dante is the opposite of Trish, fully leaning into the legacy and heritage of his familial bonds, to the extent of literally becoming his father in the final fight. The two of them actually mirror each other perfectly. This also extends to the themes on family, with the two of them both playing a part in killing an old family member. Dante doing it unwillingly to put the past to rest, and Trish doing it intentionally so she can start a new future. And in the process of them both losing their old family, they're able to find a new one together because just like your heritage and legacy, your family is something you can choose for yourself. The only question that's left open to us is trying to work out what kind of family they are. As I said before, the themes of Devil May Cry are not particularly deep, and you do need to use different sequels, external media, and a lot of headcanoning to really get the most out of it. But I don't really think that matters, because at the end of the day, I do think that these games are ultimately made for toony teenagers who want to see a cool, edgy guy do some badass stuff. Trying to complain about such things comes off a little bit weird. It's like complaining that the game doesn't do something it wasn't trying to do just because it shows a glimmer of that stuff despite that. Nevertheless, the game ends with our heroes flying off into the sunrise of a brand new day to establish a new legend of the devil hunter Dante and Trish, his sidekick. God damn it, girl, I know you're new to all of this, but have some self-respect, please. It's a very simple, happy ending with no real setup for any future plans, with it only having a epilogue scene and a credit sequence of the two of them posing like badasses. And it makes it very clear that Capcom and Kamiya had no bloody clue how well this series would go on to be. I just hope this isn't the case again, because please Capcom, I'm begging you here, the gap between now and DMC 5 is now bigger than the gap between 5 and the reboot. I'm starving. And no, unfortunately, these two don't count. Now, we are technically done here, but every single DMC game is fundamentally an arcade experience, which means that the game extends far beyond hitting credits, and DMC 1 is no exception to this. In fact, Kamiya doesn't even let you feel closure for beating the game, because the moment you do, you're instantly flung into DMC 1's hard mode. Now, DMC's hard mode, later renamed to Son of Sparda difficulty, is very important to the series because it essentially replaces every single normal playthrough from now on. Well, providing you don't just want to restart a vanilla run. For starters, hard mode is a new game plus option, which means you carry over pretty much everything you could. Progression based items are a no-go, but you do carry over every single weapon, move, gun, and health upgrade that you could possibly need. This means that you can experience the entire game with your full arsenal and moveset no matter what. But to compensate for your increased power level, the game, as the mode suggests, also makes itself harder too. Now, it could just do this by increasing the damage you take and decreasing the damage you deal, and it does do this. But what it also does is remix every single enemy encounter to introduce later game enemies into earlier levels. There's still a little bit of a difficulty curve throughout the game, but you start off much closer to where you ended on your normal playthrough. Enemies like the Frosts, who are usually only introduced in mission 17 onwards, can show up as early as mission 5 or 6. And what this ends up doing is letting you experience the entire game with a much more diverse set of gameplay parameters. Since you're now much more experienced with the combat, you don't need to spend 3 to 4 levels just fighting puppets to acclimatize to it. You're now able to enjoy the entire game firing on all cylinders at all times. You don't have to wait for it to warm up anymore. And I'm not saying that if you've not beaten it on Son of Sparda mode, you haven't beaten Devil May Cry, but I do think if you haven't played them, then you're doing yourself a bit of a disservice, because there's a lot more that these games have to offer outside of their initial playthrough. Considering these games are as short as they are, I think something like this is excellent. Due to the way it's structured, DMC does kind of work like an arcade game, and you can play through it multiple times very quickly. And something like this is just a really good option for people who want to play it over and over. One that can appeal to both new-time veterans who want a slightly harder experience now that they've mastered the systems, but also to a more casual fan who'd only really want to play it again because they could experience something new. Now, if you go on to complete a hard mode playthrough, you unlock 2 more things. Firstly is Dante Must Die mode, a even harder difficulty that honestly I kinda struggle with. This one I'd say is more okay to give a skip on. It's significantly harder to the point where unless you're a really hardcore fan, I imagine you'll probably not get that much enjoyment out of it. Even to this day, I've not beaten all of the games on DMD difficulty without using items. It's also not got as much in terms of new content compared to Son of Sparda. For the most part, the enemy encounters are exactly the same as hard mode, just with the attack and defense values of them all being amped up. The one interesting difference is that now the demons that you're fighting can use Devil Trigger as well. They don't get a fancy transformation or anything, but if you take too long killing them all, then they'll start glowing with demonic energy and get an even further attack and defense buff than what they already do. Not to mention, just like your Devil Trigger, they gain access to some light super armor, making them extra difficult to combo. You can still launch them, but you need to hit them just a few times to put them into a stagger state before you do so. It's a cool little extra mode, but unlike Son of Sparda, I wouldn't necessarily consider it essential for the full Devil May Cry experience. 2 things you might not know about DMC1's version of Dante Must Die difficulty is that you don't actually get any healing when using your Devil Trigger in this mode. Hard mode already reduces the amount of healing you get from DT, but Dante Must Die does away with it completely. Luckily, this is somewhat offset with a peculiar way of how your DT interacts with the enemies. See, in DMC1, the Devil Trigger that the enemies get actually give them a much bigger boost to attack and defense than what yours does. So you'd think that letting the enemy go into DT would be disastrous. And if you're not using your Devil Trigger, it can take an absolute age taking out a puppet who's popped his. But in DMC1, against Devil Triggered enemies specifically, your DT basically just cancels out whatever buff that they would have gotten from it. And so in a weird roundabout way, despite the lack of healing, it actually means that your Devil Trigger actually gets buffed on DMD. The other unlock for beating hard mode is actually gaining access to a Sparda themed costume. What's weird is this isn't really a costume because it does have a couple of gameplay implications too. Most notably, to use this costume, you need to start a save file from scratch. But when you do, you'll find that if you look in your inventory, on top of starting with Force Edge, you'll also have access to Yamato, a sword that would later go on to be Virgil's signature weapon. And this sword's a little bit weird. It's kind of like a halfway point between Force Edge and Alistair, with it having a bit more damage and range than the former, but less than the latter. And buying new moves for Alistair like Stinger and Round Trip will be applied to Yamato too. Which seems weird because I get why you'd use this over Force Edge, but Alistair, which you get at the beginning of Mission 2, outranks it in every way. And the reason is when using Yamato, you have the very weird niche case of gaining access to Devil Sword Sparda whenever you go into Devil Trigger. You still get the normal damage of Devil Sword Sparda, but you get all of the other benefits with DT when using it. Now, there's still more cons to using it over Alistair than pros, but it does mean that it fills a very specific niche case. Having access to a much better hitbox when in DT does seem nice, but I'd rather just have access to air raid and a better sword the rest of the time instead. But yeah, that's just about it for Devil May Cry 1. You do unlock Super Dante after beating Dante Must Die difficulty, which is just regular Dante, but he has infinite Devil Trigger. There's unfortunately nothing like Bloody Palace here, which is one of those simple little things that I wish that they'd add if they ever make a remake of this game. And speaking of which, I did say in the Trish section that I'd go over a few things that I'd like to see if a remake was to happen. As I said before, I wouldn't want them to radically change too much because I don't want it necessarily feeling like DMC 3, 4 and 5. I think a really big benefit to this game is just how grounded the combat is compared to later entries. Not only because it makes for a better introduction to the series and subgenre that can ease the players into it, but also I think a relatively more grounded combo style complements the stylings and aesthetic of DMC 1 a lot more. So much of this game takes place in gloomy, tight, atmospheric corridors, and a lot of Dante's wacky bullshit just wouldn't suit it. And so, probably controversially, what I would want to do is take away the style system but try and implement various little bits of it just into Dante's core gameplay. You wouldn't have a full moveset of any given style, but you'd have various aspects of it integrated into your core moveset. For example, you'd still have the better tricks to dodge, but you'd have to use it by dodging last minute, just like Nero's table hopper ability. And you could add more moves to the existing weapons either via a second attack button or by adding the inputs that DMC 1 just doesn't use. You know, like having specials in the air or using stuff like back-forward inputs. You could also give Ifrit a combo B because it is sorely lacking one. And naturally, fast weapon switching for swords and guns would also be an incredibly big boon. What I'd change narratively, however, is how you get Alistair and Ifrit. Part of the DMC lore is that demons can survive by submitting to whoever beat them and turning into devil arm weapons for them to use. And this is something we all see in DMC 3 and 5. So what I'd like to see is Dante actually fight Alistair and Ifrit. You could still have that famous Alistair cutscene immediately after the boss fight as this final ditch attempt to try and take out Dante, but you could also have a cool boss fight alongside it. This would also give the remake an opportunity to have a new boss fight specifically designed to really lean into any new combat additions. In Alistair's case, we actually have a design for him in Beautiful Joe. And considering that design, if I was making a remake, I would have a boss fight with Alistair that really let me show off the new air combat. Doing so would also allow the game to show you a bunch of Alistair's moves on an enemy before you get them. It'll make moves like air raid all the more enticing because you'll look at it and go, I remember that move, it was really annoying to deal with, I want to be able to use it against my enemies. Meanwhile for Ifrit, you could have a brand new fight to get the weapon and it'd be open season because there's not really any designs pre-existing. Personally, however, since there's a lot of punch and kick weapons throughout DMC, I'd want to make it a little bit more interesting. And instead, I'd want to change its name and its design a little bit and make it a new weapon that you get after fighting Phantom for the final time. You could still have it be a fiery punch and kick weapon, but have extra arms come out of the back of it, thus making it a more unique looking weapon whilst being able to add more on top of it now that you have the gimmick of multiple arms. Because personally, I like the idea of Phantom, Griffon and Nightmare giving you their own weapons as well. Hell, Nightmare already has a weapon in the game that you could give to the player at the end of its boss fights. Unfortunately, the problem with that is that Phantom would end up being a little bit redundant since Ifrit is already a fire weapon. Griffon on the other hand could very easily be another long range weapon, or you could just write round it saying that's the reason why Mundus killed him, so you don't need to worry about any redundancies with Alistair. And if you really wanted to, you could add more original bosses to the game to add new weapons in any shape or form. In fact, as much as I do like the repeat boss fights, something you could do to make the game much more enjoyable to a wider audience is cutting down how many of them there are and replacing them with brand new ones. Again, I wouldn't want them to add too much, but there is a lot you could play around with. Anyway, this video is already excessively long and I don't need to drag it out anymore. The whole point of this entire video has been that I feel like over time a lot of people have kind of disregarded DMC 1, especially the newer fans. And I can certainly see why. If you've come into the series expecting what you've seen in gameplay videos from DMC 5, DMC 1 can seem very reserved in comparison. But I can't stress enough how good of an introduction it is to the character action subgenre. And I think that the combat, while good for its time, still has a very unique feel to it as well. It's still an incredibly memorable game, and it still has the best art direction in the series. Some of the other games come close in certain areas, but I don't think any other DMC game nails every single individual aspect as much as DMC 1 does. And I think some of those more archaic areas of the game that don't necessarily play as good or smooth as a more modern title are definitely a bit frustrating, but that shared suffering from weird design choices is definitely worth experiencing. The story and the writing may be a bit weak in places, particularly during the ending, but it's still an incredibly fun time, and with a bit of effort you can start getting so much more out of it. And even if DMC 1 by itself won't likely have you wanting to dig for more information about it, playing the future titles in the series can only increase the desire of wanting to explore more. But at the end of the day, DMC 1 has aged quite a lot over the years. It's not always the most appetizing game for everyone, but what it is a short, low commitment title that's easy to run through and readies the palate for so much more to come. It's something that you'll probably find that even if you didn't like it that much at first, if you play it enough, you'll start acquiring a taste for it over time and realize that everything that made you think that it was kinda old, outdated and archaic is actually what makes it special, and that it may seem like it's aged much more than its younger siblings, but you have to keep in mind that it's had more time to age in the first place. It's a game that comes on strong, is a little rough around the edges, and is a bit lumpy in places. It may even seem very different to how you once remembered it years ago, but in the process has become something very special in its own right. And that, my fellow gamers, is exactly why Devil May Cry 1 has aged like milk, to become a very smelly, stinky, but also tasty wedge of gourmet cheese. And I wouldn't want it any other way. Hey gamers, thanks for watching. I know this video has been a long time coming. Some of the footage that I was using is actually 2 years old now. So if you've been waiting for it for as long as I've been teasing it, then I deeply apologize for it taking this long. This whole project has changed form multiple times. Originally it was meant to be a small part of a different video, and I realized as I was making it that it was getting longer and longer and longer and becoming its own video, and then on top of that becoming a really long one at that. I had various ideas crop up halfway through, like having the mission-like structure for all of the paragraphs while I was writing it. At one point I was even considering cribbing off Maxor a bit and having all of the cutscenes re-voiced and redubbed by myself to add in silly little jokes here and there. Which admittedly some of the jokes did still make it into the script in some shape or form, like the Dante saving Trish cutscene and various other moments as well. The reason why I didn't really do this is because the middle of the game doesn't really have many cutscenes, so there was a big gap where you wouldn't see it for a good while during the video. I also particularly didn't like how, because of this, the jokes in the early cutscenes and late cutscenes had a very different feel to them. But alas, I eventually got it done, and I think it turned out pretty well. This whole thing took a lot of work and tons of reworks for it to eventually come out, and I'm really proud of what I've done, but it has taken a lot out of me. Honestly, working on that really long Castlevania video at the same time probably didn't help. And with that all being said, I'm probably gonna reduce how often I do these long sort of videos from now on, unless this one really takes off or something. Or rather, at the very least, I do want to still do them, but I'm probably not going to make another one that's 3+ hours long again. With that all being said, with this taking as much work as it has done, I really would like it if you could like, comment, subscribe, do any of that crap. If you're one of the few people who have the hype button, that would probably be a really big help. I still don't fully know how the hype button works properly, but apparently it's really good for channels like mine. Alternatively, I also have my Patreon that I still need to do a proper announcement video for. And speaking of which, shout out to my one Patreon, Ray Channer, who's given me all the support you have. But with that all being said, this video is already exceedingly long, so I won't make it any longer, because rendering it is going to take an absolute age. So on that note, I'll see you next time, gamers.